The Vanir gods of Norse mythology remain some of the most elusive and complex figures in the ancient northern traditions. Their names and stories often blur, tangled in layers of myth and local legend. Yet despite this complexity, a recognizable pattern emerges. The Vanir resemble fertility deities found in many parts of the world, gods and goddesses who bring growth, abundance, and the continuation of life. In figures like Freyr and Freya, we see familiar motifs of renewal, fecundity, and seasonal cycles that echo across cultures. According to the medieval writer Snorri Sturluson, the Vanir were once a rival tribe of gods who fought the Aesir before eventually forging peace. Yet aside from Njord and Freyr, few Vanir names are preserved in the surviving myths. It's likely that the Vanir once included a vast collection of local fertility deities, gods of specific regions, villages, and families, whose identities have now faded. Names like Ing, Scyld, and Frodi hint at a much broader pantheon that once existed. Freyr himself, revered as the god of prosperity and growth, seems to have embodied a title more than a personal name. Just as Freya means simply lady, Freyr means lord. In festivals like May Day, echoes of these ancient fertility figures may still linger. Frodi, whose name means fruitful, appears in several legends as a wise and prosperous king. But like Freyr, he too may have been more of a symbolic figure than a historical one. Across the northern world, fertility gods were likely represented by priest kings, living men who embodied the god for a time and served as vessels of his divine power. Though some temples held statues and relics of the Vanir, the true power of these gods often lived through the people who served them. What sets the Vanir apart is their closeness to human life. They weren't distant or abstract like sky gods. They were intertwined with everyday existence, offering fertility to the land, livestock, and family. Rulers were seen as legitimate only when the Vanir were on their side, and the favor of the gods brought both prosperity and peace. The seeresses, or wise women, who traveled from home to home, were seen as messengers of the Vanir. In them, the divine walked among humans, bringing blessings, prophecy, and guidance in the name of Frigg or Freya. Unlike gods concerned with law, morality, or justice, the Vanir did not distinguish between good and evil. Their role was simply to bring life, to nourish, to increase, and to awaken. They offered power over the unseen, access to knowledge through visions and dreams, and the ecstatic joy of shared rituals where god and worshipper met in celebration. This life-giving power was intangible but vital. Without it, no victory in battle, no wisdom in leadership could save a people. Crops would fail, children would die, and entire communities would face ruin. That is why every early society offered honor and service to fertility powers. In the harsh climates of the north, with poor soil, bitter winters, and long, dark nights, the Vanir's gift of life was even more sacred because it was so uncertain. Connecting with the Vanir sometimes required intense and strange ceremonies. Fertility rites often included ecstatic dancing, sacrifices, and even orgiastic rituals. These acts were seen as expressions of rebirth, mirroring the sprouting of new life in the fields. As some scholars have noted, such ceremonies symbolized the return of chaos before creation, allowing life to begin anew. Through this sacred disorder, the world was refreshed. The Vanir's religion included not only joy and abundance, but also awe and fear. They were connected to the earth, to death, and to the mysterious forces below. They rivaled Odin in some traditions, both as gods of the dead and as protectors of ecstatic experiences, myth, tells us of their ancient war with the Aesir, a symbolic struggle between competing powers and beliefs. Yet, even after peace was made, the Vanir remained honored, particularly by Swedish kings who bore the image of the boar, an animal sacred to Freyr. These kings were thought to be possessed by the spirit of the Vanir, serving as temporary vessels for divine presence. Many people preferred the Vanir to Odin. Their power felt closer, more stable, more generous. Unlike Odin, whose favor could be swift and treacherous, the Vanir worshippers of the Vanir remained rooted in the soil. They honored the ancestors buried within it and rarely looked to the distant sky. Yet some myths offer a vision of a peaceful land across the sea, a paradise that echoes the hope of eternal life. More often, though, the Vanir were linked to the depths of the earth and the vastness of the sea. Their male gods chose giantesses as brides, forging ties with primordial forces. Freyr himself fell in love with Gerd, a radiant maiden of the underworld, embodying the Vanir's bond with the deep and the mysterious. Beneath the rituals and myths of the Vanir lies a deeper idea: the Earth Mother, the great goddess who shelters and nourishes all. In the seeress's journeys beyond the veil, and in the dreams she brings back, we glimpse the ancient roots of these gods. They are the spirits of land and sea, of growth and death, and of the power that pulses through all living things. And though time and conquest have buried their temples and faded their names, the legacy of the Vanir still lingers, in the soil, in the stories, and perhaps in the very rhythm of the seasons. The sea played a central role in the lives of the people of northwestern Europe. It shaped their daily routines, determined their survival, and naturally became woven into their mythology. Many of the oldest Norse tales take place against the backdrop of the sea, whether it's Gefjon plowing the land, Thor on his fishing expedition, or the solemn funeral of Balder. The gods of the north weren't confined to mountains or forests. They were just as familiar with the vast, unpredictable waters. For the seafaring communities of the north, the ocean was both a lifeline and a threat. It provided food, trade, and travel, but also brought danger, loss, and death. It's no surprise then that their gods were seen as rulers of both land and sea. Among them, Ægir stands out as the powerful spirit of the ocean, embodying its strength, its mystery, and its fury. His name is closely tied to the word for water itself, and his role echoes that of Poseidon in Greek myth. In Viking poetry, the ocean is often described in terms of Ægir's might. They called the river Eider Ægir's door, and when ships vanished in storms, it was said they were swallowed by the jaws of Ægir. The sea became a devourer of men. The poet Egil captures this grief when he mourns his son, lost to the waves. The sea has snapped the ties of my kin. Could I have avenged my pain with a sword, the ale brewer would be no more. Ægir, the ale brewer, becomes a grim figure, relentless, consuming, and merciless. Such a god may have inspired the brutal rituals of early seafarers. 5th century Saxon pirates were said to sacrifice every 10th captive before returning home, drawing lots to determine who would be cast into the sea. This was not random cruelty, but a ritual steeped in belief. They thought the gods demanded payment in lives for a safe voyage. What seemed to others a horrific act was, to them, a sacred obligation, an offering to calm the sea's wrath. Even in language, the sea was personified as a warrior. The Old English word garsek, meaning spearman, brings to mind a fierce figure like Poseidon with his trident. In Norse myth, Ægir and his wife Ran ruled the waters with a net. ran using it to catch unsuspecting sailors and pull them into her realm. When someone drowned, it was believed they had gone to Ran. If their spirit appeared at their own funeral feast, it was seen as a sign she had welcomed them well. In later sagas, this belief took on new meaning. In Fritjof's saga, sailors caught in a storm were told to carry gold on them, so that if they drowned, they could enter Ran's hall with an offering. One hero even handed out gold to his men before their ship went down, ensuring they wouldn't arrive empty-handed. This vision of Aegir and Ran as eerie hosts, eagerly gathering souls into their underwater banquet hall, mirrors the role of gods who ruled over death and fate. But Aegir wasn't only a destroyer. In other stories, he appears as a gracious host. He brews ale for the gods and hosts lavish feasts in his ocean hall. The Lokasena, a poem filled with drama and scandal, takes place during one of Aegir's banquets, where Loki insults every god and goddess in turn. On another occasion, Thor ventures out to find a massive cauldron, so Aegir can brew enough mead for another. There's something strikingly similar between this image and the myths of other cultures. In Celtic legends, magical cauldrons of plenty are often found in the lands beneath the waves. These underwater realms, mysterious and unreachable, were seen as places of abundance and transformation. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic author who compiled much of Norse mythology, identifies Aegir with other sea figures like Gymir and Hlær, who lived on the island of Hlýsi. Interestingly, Gymir is the name of a terrifying underworld giant, the father of Gerd, the radiant maiden who became Freyr's beloved. Another sea figure, Heimir, appears in a tale where Thor visits him to obtain the famous cauldron. Heimir is described as a giant, but also as the father of the god Tyr, suggesting a deeper, more ancient connection between these sea spirits and the divine. Aegir, then, is more than a single god. He is a symbol of the sea's power, its contradictions, and its mystery. He is both the banquet host and the destroyer, both the giver of mead and the taker of lives. In him, the people of the North saw not just a god, but the living force of the ocean itself, a force that could bless them with bounty or claim them without warning. Aegir's true nature has long been a subject of debate. While he is often counted among the gods, some traditions suggest he belongs more rightly among the giants. He is said to have fathered 9 daughters, figures widely interpreted as the personifications of ocean waves. Their names, like Yolp the Howler and Gripe the Grasper, evoke the violent nature of the sea. Interestingly, these names are also associated with giantesses in Norse myth, hinting at deeper and older connections between sea spirits and the ancient race of giants. This connection grows even more intriguing when we consider Heimdall, the ever-watchful guardian of Asgard. Some verses suggest that Heimdall was born from the sea, raised by 9 mothers who were likely these wave daughters of Aegir. The mystery of his origin may link Norse traditions to Celtic ones, where similar tales of sea maidens appear. Jean Young once noted an Irish saga in which 9 sea giants mother a child together. In this tale, a man named Ruad sails toward Norway, only to have his ships mysteriously halted. When he dives beneath the waves to investigate, he finds 9 giant women, 3 clinging to each ship. They pull him into the sea, where he spends one night with each. One becomes pregnant, and Ruad promises to return after visiting Norway. But when he breaks that vow and returns to Ireland instead, the sea women track him down, bringing with them the child born from the union. Failing to catch Ruad, they kill the child and hurl its head after him in vengeance. Stories like this don't end with Ireland. Similar themes appear in medieval German legends. One such figure is Vru Wachilt, described as a sea woman and the mother of the giant Wade. Her story is found in the Thidreks saga, a 13th century text composed in Norway but heavily influenced by German tradition. According to the tale, King Vilsinus meets a mysterious woman in the forest. She later appears from the sea, clinging to his ship, just like the Irish giantesses. She tells him she will bear his child, and after giving birth to Wade, she vanishes back into the sea. She appears again in the German poem Rabenschlacht, rescuing her descendant Widia from danger by pulling him and his horse into the ocean's depths. Widia, better known as Wittich, is portrayed as the grandson of Wade and great-grandson of Wakilt, creating a mythic lineage deeply tied to the sea. Scholars like Schneider believed this genealogy reflected genuine early Germanic tradition, while others, such as Chambers, saw Wade as an ancient sea giant, possibly from the Baltic, whose legends spread among early settlers in Britain. In English folklore, Wade's name became attached to ruins and Roman roads, but in Denmark he remained linked to the sea. One memorable tale tells of him carrying his son, Wayland the Smith, on his shoulders as he waded through the deep waters of Gronasund, a moving image of strength and protection amid the sea's uncertainty. These stories of sea women and their children point to a strong connection between the giants of the ocean and those who lived deep within the earth or high in the mountains. In mythology, these boundaries often blur. Poseidon, the Greek god often compared to Aegir, was not only ruler of the sea, but also known as the Earth Shaker, with dominion over earthquakes as well. In both Norse and Celtic tradition, we find similar overlaps, especially in myths involving cauldrons, deep waters, and powerful women of the sea. The connections between Norse and Celtic myths are most visible in these maritime legends. This isn't surprising when we remember that it was across the sea that these two cultures came into contact. Through exploration, trade, and conquest, their stories merged, weaving together shared fears, hopes, and beliefs about the forces that shaped their world, from the waves of the ocean to the echoes beneath the earth. The god Njord, father of Freyr and Freya, was deeply connected to the sea in Norse belief. According to the Edda poems, his home was called Noatun, meaning enclosure of ships, a name that reflects his maritime power. Snorri describes him as the deity who commands the winds and the sea, and who brings wealth to those who fish and sail. Place names along Norway's western coast that bear his name suggest that he was widely worshipped there. Even further inland, places associated with water, whether at the edges of fjords, beside rivers, or on islands, carry his name, showing his continued link with aquatic landscapes. Some of these places, especially those ending in I, point to island cult sites, which echoes the ancient worship of the goddess Nerthus, described by Roman historians. One Norwegian island, now called Tysnes, was once known as Njord's Bath, implying it was sacred to him, along with the lake that surrounded it. This reminds us of Nerthus's sacred rituals, in which her wagon was ritually washed in a lake before being returned to her island sanctuary. These parallels suggest a long-standing tradition of water-centered worship connected to fertility and the divine. Ships played a powerful role in the mythology of the Vanir, the divine family to which Njord and his children belonged. Freyr, for instance, owned a magical ship called Skidbladnir. Other legendary figures tied to Freyr also arrive by ship across the sea to rule for a time, and then vanish back over the waves when their rule ends. From the earliest times, the ship was more than just a vessel. It was a sacred symbol. Bronze Age rock carvings in Scandinavia often show ships alongside horses and sun wheels, hinting at an early link between seafaring, solar cycles, and fertility rituals. The ship became a frequent offering in sacred rites. At one Danish site, archaeologists discovered a remarkable deposit: 100 miniature boats, each engraved with symbols, carefully packed inside one another and buried in a clay vessel. In the Iron Age, even full-size ships were used in ritual sacrifice. One such example was found in a peat bog at Hjortspring, where a large vessel had been abandoned alongside the remains of horses and dogs. This powerful offering seems to have been meant for a divine being who ruled over land and sea. Eventually, ships took on a new symbolic role. They became a vessel for the dead. On the island of Gotland and elsewhere, early graves were shaped like boats, with stones marking the outline. Later, real boats, or parts of them, were used for burials. In some cases, the wooden remains survived in the peat. In others, only the nails and rivets remained, buried among cremation ashes. This tradition began in Sweden and slowly spread to Norway and Anglo-Saxon England, where ship burials became an iconic element of elite pagan funerals. One of the most striking examples of this practice comes from England: the burial at Sutton Hoo. In the early 7th century, long after Christianity had formally arrived in East Anglia, a great pagan ritual was carried out. A massive sea-going ship, around 80 feet long, was hauled inland to a ridge above the estuary. There, it was placed in a trench and covered with a burial mound. At its center, on the deck, a wooden chamber was built, and inside were treasures fit for a king: fine jewelry, a ceremonial sword and shield, silverware, feasting gear, a harp, and even a royal standard. No body was ever found in the tomb. Perhaps the king died far from home, or was buried according to Christian custom, while his riches were left in the earth as a last echo of older rites. Either way, the ship stood as a symbol, not only of death, but of the divine journey, of honor, of continuity between the sea, the gods, and the afterlife. Sometime in the 9th century, another grand ship burial took place, this time at Oseberg in Norway. Though the grave was looted in antiquity, archaeologists recovered a stunning array of carved wooden artifacts that revealed the lavish nature of the funeral. Inside the ship lay the remains of a woman, and around her were the traces of horses and dogs that had been sacrificed at the burial site. Similar scenes played out at other legendary Norwegian ship burials, such as those at Gokstad and Tune, where animals were also ritually slain as part of the ceremony. In Sweden, rich ship burials were uncovered in the ancient cemeteries of Vendel and Valsgärde. Although such funerals were less common in Denmark, the grave at Ladby stood out for its scale and the same ritual inclusion of horses and dogs. These elaborate ceremonies were reserved for important individuals, people of status and influence within their communities. But even ordinary people found their way into ship graves. All across Scandinavia, and in areas where Vikings settled, simple boat burials were conducted for those of humbler means. By the early 1900s, the number of known ship graves had already reached the thousands, and more have been discovered since. Recent archaeological work has revealed just how significant ship symbolism was for the early pagan communities in eastern England. At Sutton Hoo, the famous 7th century ship burial stands as a monument to this tradition. But it was not alone. Earlier boat burials have been identified in the same cemetery, and a large ship was once buried at Snape, though it was never properly excavated. One striking discovery came from the Anglian Cemetery at Caister-on-Sea in Norfolk. Several graves there held bodies that had been covered by sections of boats, their outlines preserved by the iron clinch nails still fixed in place. Even the grave of a child featured two pieces of curved boat wood, raised above the body to form a symbolic arch. In another example, a cremation urn kept in Norwich Museum shows the careful carving of a ship on its surface, further proof of the deep connection between ships and the world of the dead. We may never fully understand what the ship meant in the minds of these early peoples, but it clearly carried powerful meaning. While myths don't spell it out directly, the strongest clues link ship burial to the worship of the Vanir gods, especially Freyr. According to legend, a Danish king named Frodi, thought to be Freyr in another form, issued a law requiring that all noble warriors who died in battle be burned in their ships, and lesser men grouped together, 10 to a vessel. Some sagas support this tradition. In Vatnsdæla saga, the character Ingimund is buried in a boat. In Gisla saga, a priest of Freyr named Thorgrim is laid in his ship, sealed within a mound. Before the tomb is closed, the man who killed him hurls a massive stone down onto the ship, strikingly similar to the Oseberg burial, where a great stone was also placed atop the vessel. It has even been suggested that the woman buried at Oseberg may have been a priestess of the Vanir, especially since an ornate ceremonial wagon was buried with her. Perhaps the most moving description of a ship funeral comes not from Norse texts, but from early English poetry. The epic Beowulf offers a powerful vision of such a ceremony, written around the year 1000, but likely composed long before that. It describes the funeral of Scyld, the legendary first king of the Danes. In the poem, the old king is honored with a magnificent ship burial, just as he had arrived into the world, alone and carried over the waves. The poet writes that no ship had ever been more richly prepared. Inside were laid weapons of war, armor, and treasure, gifts of equal value to those given to him when he was first set adrift as a child. A golden banner was raised high above him, and then, solemnly, the people released the ship into the sea. Their hearts were heavy with sorrow, unsure of who, if anyone, would receive their king in the distant realm across the waves. The image is haunting, but it captures the deep spiritual significance the ship held in the minds of early northern peoples. It was not only a vessel for travel, it was a bridge between worlds. This ancient tale of Scyld's funeral reads like more than just a story. It feels like a myth crafted to explain a rite. It hints that the kings of East Anglia may have been buried in ships because their legendary ancestor, Scyld, departed from his people in the same majestic way. Such memories, like that of the burial at Sutton Hoo, might have lived on in oral traditions or family lore when this myth was first put into words. One can imagine the ship that held a king's treasures being rowed out from a harbor near his royal seat at Rendlesham, gliding up the River Deben to the royal cemetery, where a burial mound stood waiting. In such a ritual, the ship would not be sent out to sea, as the poem says, but instead committed to the earth. Its journey turned inward, toward the realm of the gods. The treasures buried alongside these rulers must have been meant as offerings for the next world, just as Scyld was sent off with wealth to accompany him beyond the horizon. There was likely a deep belief that such riches would follow the dead king into a divine realm, a journey not only of body, but of spirit. As for the idea of burning a body at sea, setting it ablaze on a floating ship, we can't say with certainty whether it ever truly happened. though it's famously described in the myth of Balder, the shining god whose funeral was witnessed by the gods themselves. There are no reliable, first-hand accounts of such rites being carried out in real life. A few later stories tell of warrior kings like Haki of Norway or Sigurdring of Sweden being sent off in burning ships. But these accounts come from much later and may be nothing more than poetic echoes of myth. It's possible that such tales developed as symbolic explanations for the ancient practice of burning the dead in ships after death. These funeral scenes may have been dramatic retellings, grounded not in eyewitness memory, but in mythic origin stories, rituals reimagined as the final voyage of a race's founding hero. What remains clear, however, is that the ship was more than just a tool of transport. It was a sacred image, one that likely had deep connections to the gods of the sea and fertility, especially the Vanir. The use of the ship in funerary rites wasn't limited to the north. In ancient Egypt, ships were placed near the pyramids and buried in royal tombs. In the New Kingdom, even models of ships accompanied pharaohs into the afterlife. These vessels represented more than wealth. They symbolized the sun's passage across the sky, the journey into the realm of the gods. For the Egyptians, the ship embodied warmth, life, and rebirth. Since life depended on the waters of the Nile, it became a powerful symbol of fertility, an offering both practical and divine. That connection between ships and fertility is even more striking in the worship of Isis, whose symbol was a sacred vessel. In Roman times, a festival in her honor took place every March in the harbor of Ostia. A ship was blessed and set adrift without a crew, offered as a gift to the sea and the goddess. Isis was deeply associated with fertility, and in the mythic imagination of the North, she found her counterpart in goddesses like Nerthus and Freya. In the 3rd century, a goddess known as Nehelenia was worshipped on the island of Walcheren, off the Dutch coast. Although her temple was eventually swallowed by sand, countless carved stones were left behind. On them, she's shown holding fruit and a horn of plenty, often standing beside a ship. These stones, left behind by travelers seeking safe passage across the North Sea, tell us how deeply ships were tied to the divine. Nehelenia was clearly linked to the great mothers of myth, and her image bore all the marks of a goddess of abundance. And so, when we hear that Njord was revered as a god of the sea and ships, we recognize an ancient pattern, one that stretches back across cultures and centuries. Ships were never just vessels. For the people of the North, they were sacred symbols of peace, plenty, and the mysterious journey into the afterlife. The Vanir were the gods to whom fishermen and farmers alike turned in times of need. If crops failed or fish vanished from the sea, disaster loomed. The people prayed for a double harvest, one from the land and one from the waters. And it was to the Vanir, the deities of earth and ocean, that they offered their hopes. The ship, in all its mystery, carried those hopes across the sea and into eternity. Across the ancient world, water was never seen merely as a source of food or a path for trade. Its role in the great pagan religions went far deeper. Water was life itself, an origin of wisdom, renewal, and transformation. It was believed to inspire the soul, cleanse the body, and even offer rebirth. In Norse mythology, after the fires of Ragnarok had destroyed the old world, a new world was destined to rise, emerging not from the ashes, but from the ocean. It was a return, not a replacement. The land would be born again, and the forgotten gold game pieces of the old gods would lie gleaming in the grass, untouched and waiting. From this sacred sea, rulers were said to come, figures of peace and promise. Myths tell of children drifting alone in boats, carried across the waters to begin a new cycle. These images, simple and powerful, bridged the divine with the human. The child from the sea was more than a symbol. It was a sign that a new beginning had come, that the world of men was once again touched by the world of gods. Yet the sea, for all its gifts, was also feared. It was not only the bringer of life, it was the harbinger of doom. In the final days of the gods, it would rise with fire and swallow everything: the homes of men, the halls of the gods, the very earth itself. At the heart of this destruction was a monstrous serpent, ancient and coiled deep within the ocean. Known as the girdle of the earth, this creature encircled the world, waiting for the moment of fury when it would unleash chaos and drag all creation beneath the waves. Thor, protector of gods and men, stood as the last defense against this sea-born terror. His epic fishing battle with the serpent wasn't just a test of strength, it was a cosmic struggle between order and annihilation. Had he failed to defeat the beast, the world would have ended that very day. Even in the light-hearted tale where Thor tries to lift the serpent disguised as a giant cat, there's a flicker of dread. Those watching knew that beneath the humor lay a terrible truth. The sea serpent was no ordinary creature. It was the eternal enemy of the sky god, a force that threatened the balance of the universe. This serpent, like Leviathan or the Kraken in other mythologies, was not alone. It belonged to a realm of giants and creatures of death, beasts that slithered through shadows and guarded the thresholds of the grave. Alongside it stood the fiery dragon of Norse legend, rising from the earth itself, from stone, cave, or burial mound, another guardian of death and chaos. But that tale awaits in the next chapter. Together, sea and earth formed the twin mysteries of existence. One gave life, the other reclaimed it. Both were revered and feared, and both played a vital role in the mythic world. From the depths of ocean and soil came inspiration, destruction, rebirth, and decay. And from these dark foundations, the shimmering halls of Asgard were raised, set high above a world always on the edge of ruin and renewal. In the earliest days, the Germanic peoples made great sacrifices to the gods they worshipped. Among them were Tiwaz and Woden, gods of war and power, who received the bodies of fallen warriors and captured enemies. But over time, Woden rose above the rest. The Romans, who saw echoes of their own god Mercury in him, believed he had become supreme. Kings traced their ancestry back to him, and he was honored with the most sacred and terrible of rituals: human sacrifice through fire, strangulation, or the spear. In Norse myth, Woden became Odin, the Allfather, ruler of Asgard. Even the mighty Thor, the thunder god, was now seen as his son, though some sources still placed Thor first among the gods. Odin was far more than a war god. He was mysterious, one-eyed, deeply wise, and steeped in magic. A master of transformation and secrets, he wandered the realms, rode his eight-legged horse Sleipnir through the sky, and sought knowledge even from the dead. He was the god who moved between worlds, from the lands of men to the depths of the unknown. The connection between Odin and Mercury suggests more than just a similarity in appearance. The Romans were not easily fooled by hats and cloaks. They saw in Woden a god of trade, of intellect, and of journeys, both in life and after death. Like Mercury, he was the messenger between worlds. German inscriptions dedicated to Mercury often name him as a merchant, and in the north, Odin was called the god of cargoes. He was also credited with bringing the runes, symbols of knowledge and power, to the people, just as Mercury was linked with learning. Old English poetry echoes this as well. In one verse, when asked who first created the letters, the answer is Mercurius the giant. Odin, too, was said to soar through the sky, disguised as a bird or cloaked as a traveler, always arriving unannounced, always on a mission. His 8-legged steed carried him across the heavens, just as Woden had done in older Germanic tales. Even in the ancient Mersburg charm, Woden is shown healing a horse, a reminder of his long-standing bond with these animals. Perhaps the most telling connection is Odin's role as a guide of souls. Like Mercury, he was believed to lead the dead to the other world. This is the aspect of Odin that reveals him most clearly as the god of the dead. Odin's link to shamanism helps explain much of his nature. Across Siberia, northeastern Europe, and even the Americas, shamans served as intermediaries between the living and the divine. In trance states, they journeyed in spirit to the heavens or to the land of the dead, seeking wisdom or recovering lost souls. They were healers, prophets, and storytellers. Odin, with his magical knowledge, his quests for wisdom, and his travels to the underworld, fits this pattern perfectly. His horse, Sleipnir, with its 8 legs, is a classic shamanic symbol. In many traditions, shamans ride animals or birds in their spirit journeys. Where horses are common, these steeds often appear in myths and rituals, flying through the air or galloping into other realms. A striking tale from Central Asia tells of a shamanic woman whose second husband was a spirit. When one of their horses gave birth to a foal with 8 legs, her husband unknowingly cut off 4 of them. In sorrow, the woman cried out, for that foal was her magical mount. She vanished, becoming the guardian spirit of her people. The image of an 8-legged horse might also have a more earthly origin. In some cultures, the body of the dead is carried on a bier by 4 men. This funeral stretcher, borne on 8 legs, could easily become a symbolic steed for the journey to the afterlife. Among the Gonds of India, a funeral song describes a magical horse with 8 legs and 4 heads, clearly referring to the bier itself. The mourners urge the dead to mount the horse and begin their final journey. In this way, Sleipnir becomes not just a magical animal, but a symbolic representation of death's passage. Odin, riding him across the boundaries of life and death, becomes the eternal guide, the god who leads the soul into the shadowed world beyond. There's little doubt that Odin's horse, Sleipnir, knew the path to the underworld well. Saxo tells us of a tale where Odin, cloaked in a mantle, carries the hero Hadding across both land and sea on Sleipnir, eventually reaching the god's distant dwelling. In the poem Baldur's Draumer, Odin once again rides the long, shadowed road into the realm of the dead. Along the way, he confronts the guardian hound at the gates of the underworld, all in an effort to consult a dead seeress. And it is Sleipnir who carries a rider down to Hel's domain in search of the slain Baldur. Whether that traveler was Odin himself or someone sent in his name remains a subject of debate. Though Odin is not always seen directly leading the souls of the dead, his servants, the Valkyries, do just that. Acting under his command, they escort fallen kings and warriors to the great hall of Valhalla. Nor was this role entirely forgotten in later Norse literature. In the Volsunga saga, Odin takes on a role much like Charon of Greek myth, rowing the body of Sigmund's son across the waters to the afterlife. In another saga, Egil's saga Oke Asmundar, he appears as the Prince of Darkness, guiding a giantess into the realm of the dead. In the poem Havamal, Odin speaks of a haunting moment, his own sacrifice. He hangs on the world tree, Yggdrasil, pierced by a spear. This echoes the grim tales of those once offered to Woden, hung from sacred trees near temples such as Uppsala. But Havamal offers a deeper layer. Odin tells us in his own words, "I know I hung on that wind-swept tree for 9 long nights, pierced by a spear, sacrificed to Odin, myself to myself." This is not a punishment. It is a sacrifice made willingly. The purpose is to gain secret knowledge. From his position on the tree, Odin gazes downward, reaching for the runes, symbols of magic and wisdom. This scene once led some to suspect Christian influence, drawing comparisons to the crucifixion. But the roots of this myth run deep into the soil of pre-Christian beliefs. Odin does not hang to redeem mankind. He hangs to seize knowledge. He says, "No bread they gave me, nor drink from a horn." I peered down below. I took up the runes. Screaming, I seized them, then fell back. The ritual of hanging from a tree connects directly to Odin's ancient identity as a god of death. It's also echoed in shamanistic traditions around the world. Young men and women undergoing shamanic initiation experience powerful visions or symbolic deaths, often through isolation, fasting, or trance. In their minds, they are cut open, torn apart, devoured by spirits, or filled with stones and animals. If they survive this ordeal, they return transformed, reborn with the power to heal, to prophesy, and to walk between the worlds. The world tree is at the center of this cosmology, just as Yggdrasil is in Norse mythology. In northern Asia, the Yakuts believed the soul of a shaman was taken by a giant bird and placed in a tree in the underworld, while the shaman's body was devoured by spirits. Elsewhere, shamans made their sacred drums from branches of the world tree. In Mongolia, they even tethered their spirit horses to it, just as Odin tethered Sleipnir to Yggdrasil. Odin's sacrifice carries both meanings. He is offered up as a death god's victim, as people once were in his name. But he is also the initiate, the seeker, who dies in spirit to gain hidden truths. Snorri Sturluson, in the Prose Edda, focuses mostly on Odin as the king of Asgard, the Allfather. But in Ynglinga Saga, Snorri also gives us the magician, the shapeshifter, who sends his spirit soaring while his body lies still. He writes, "Odin could change shape. While his body lay as if dead, he would become a bird or beast, a fish or dragon, traveling far in the blink of an eye, either for his own purposes or on behalf of others." Like the shamans, Odin seeks knowledge from the dead. In Baldur's Draumr, he not only rides to the underworld, he raises a dead seeress from her grave. Though she resists, Odin presses her for answers. She laments, "Who is this unknown man who compels me on this weary path? Snow fell on me, rain beat me, dew soaked me. I lay long dead." Each time she answers, she insists, "I have spoken unwillingly, now let me be silent." But Odin urges her again and again, "Be not silent, prophetess." Other prophetic poems follow this pattern, visionary answers from beyond the grave, delivered under pressure. They resemble the speech of a shaman awakening from a trance after journeying into the land of the dead. It's possible that those once hanged in Odin's name were believed to gain this same contact with the other world. Odin even claims to know spells that can make a hanged man speak. In another myth, he consults the severed head of Mimir, guardian of wisdom. One tale says, Odin sacrificed his eye so Mimir would let him drink from his spring, deep in the roots of the world tree. The cost was great, but in return, he gained a deeper understanding of the hidden world and its secrets. While Odin's ravens are most famously associated with battle and the feasting of the slain, there is another side to their symbolism. In the poem Grimnismal, their names, Hugin and Munin, meaning thought and memory, suggest a deeper role. Each day they fly across the world, and Odin fears they may not return. But more than thought, he fears the loss of memory. In this light, the ravens are no longer mere scavengers of war, but extensions of the god's mind, messengers of consciousness, tied to vision and wisdom. This spiritual connection may predate the Viking Age. A 7th century Swedish helmet from Vendel shows Odin on horseback with 2 birds flying above him. Even the lid of an Anglo-Saxon urn found in Newark bears twin birds that might be tied to Odin as Lord of the Dead. While this evidence is rare, it offers glimpses of continuity between the Dark Age beliefs of early Germanic peoples and the myths that survived in the Viking world. Alongside these images, we find another symbol, often shown beside Odin on horseback, or near figures of wolves and horses on cremation urns from East Anglia. It's a knot-like design known today as the Valknut, believed to represent Odin's power to bind and unbind. Ancient poems describe Odin's ability to strike men with paralysis in battle, or to release them into a state of divine madness, an ecstatic frenzy that replaced fear with inspiration. This power to loosen the mind's grip, to push warriors into a trance-like rage, or fill poets with fire, reveals another side of the god, one not of logic, but of possession, intoxication, and divine frenzy. The name Wodan, the Germanic predecessor of Odin, reflects this nature. It is believed to derive from a word meaning fury, wild passion, or ecstatic madness. In Old Norse, the word Odiar, from which the name Odin comes, carries similar meanings. It can signify rage, but also poetic inspiration and visionary insight. This is the god who gave the berserkers their fury and won the meed of poetic power for the Aesir. He is the one whose gifts blur the boundary between chaos and genius. Through him, the states of death, poetry, and prophecy became one. This link between Odin and ecstatic possession seems rooted in early Germanic religion and persisted through to the end of the heathen era in the north. It is this same intensity of experience, this sacred fury, that unites Woden, worshipped along the Rhine in the 1st century, with the later Scandinavian Odin, god of magic and the dead. His cult likely traveled northward, possibly along with the Heruli tribe, and made its way into Denmark and Sweden, where it joined older fertility cults. During the migration period, belief in Odin reached the North Sea and crossed into Britain. However, the scarcity of place names linked to Odin might hint at an ancient fear, a reluctance to invoke the name of the god of death. In later European folklore, Odin transforms again. He becomes the leader of the Wild Hunt, a spectral procession of the dead that sweeps through the skies during storms. People said they could hear the sound of galloping hooves and the howls of lost souls. In Christianized versions, Odin was replaced by the devil, but the core image remained, a dark figure leading the dead through the air on a ghostly steed. This terrifying memory likely reflects the dread his name once inspired. There is even evidence suggesting a backlash against Odin's cult during the Viking Age, driven by accusations of betrayal and moral ambiguity. This shift might explain the decline of cremation in favor of burial, and the rise of monumental ship burials in royal cemeteries. Though Odin's cult was deeply shamanistic in spirit, it's difficult to say how much of this was native and how much was influenced by Eastern traditions. Unlike many shamans, Odin is not known for using drums or dance in ritual, and there's no strong tradition connecting him with healing. Still, the similarities between Odin and shamans of the steppes and tundra are striking, especially in their shared belief in death and rebirth, visionary journeys, and spiritual ecstasy. These traits may reflect ancient cultural patterns that once linked the Germanic world to the shamanic cultures of Eurasia, patterns that faded in the West with the rise of Christianity. We also see shamanistic traits in the fertility cults of Scandinavia. This opens the door to broader questions about the influence of Eastern ideas on Viking religion, an area still shrouded in mystery. But even with the limited evidence we have, Odin remains a figure of complexity, a god of death and madness, of insight and memory, of ravens and runes, whose name carried both dread and divine power across the centuries. In Snorri's accounts, the warrior paradise, known as Valhalla, takes on a central role, but the older poetic sources offer only limited details beyond the poem Grimnismal. In that version, Valhalla is a vast hall adorned with shields and coats of mail, where wolves and eagles roam, and hundreds of doors stand ready for warriors to pour through at any threat. Inside, the dead heroes feast on pork and drink mead, served by Odin's maidens. But Snorri's portrayal merges two distinct ideas. First, the notion of a glorious afterlife granted by Odin, reserved for heroic and noble warriors, often of royal blood. And second, a vision of eternal battle, where each day ends in slaughter, and each morning brings the dead back to life to fight again before another night of feasting. The idea of warriors entering Odin's hall after death is strongly supported by later literature. Those who died violently, either in battle or as ritual sacrifices, were believed to gain entry to his realm. This belief is powerfully voiced in the death song of Ragnar Lothbrok. Though the version we have today likely dates from the 12th century, it preserves the spirit of older heathen traditions. In his final words, Ragnar expresses not fear, but exultation at the thought of meeting Odin. He speaks of the god preparing the feast, of drinking ale in carved horns, and of greeting the gods in the great hall. He does not mourn his fate, but embraces it with laughter. The poem paints a vivid picture of a warrior eager for death, certain of his reward in Odin's presence. Interestingly, Ragnar is said to have died not in battle, but in captivity, killed by venomous snakes. Whether taken literally or symbolically, this death is framed as sacrificial, with Ragnar as the willing victim. This theme of joy in death for Odin's sake appears again in accounts from other lands. One Arab observer on the Volga watched the cremation of a Norse chieftain and recorded the words of a man beside him who spoke of fire taking the dead swiftly to paradise, and laughed as he spoke, claiming that Odin had sent the wind to carry his servant away. Despite Snorri's description of Valhalla as a place for men alone, other sources hint that women could also enter Odin's realm if they died a sacrificial death. Some were burned alongside their husbands, either willingly or by tradition. Baldur's wife Nanna is said to have died of grief and was placed on the pyre beside him. In the story of King Sigurd of Sweden, a dead princess was laid next to him on his burning ship. Brynhild, after Sigurd the Volsung's death, ordered a pyre built so that she could be burned and reunited with him in the next world. On the Volga, a slave girl was stabbed, strangled, and burned with her master. She had agreed to this before the funeral and was treated with great respect until her death, almost as though she were his true wife. An extraordinary passage from Flatey Jarbok describes an old law in Sweden. It says that when a king died, the queen was to be laid beside him in the burial mound. Sigrid the Proud, who later married King Svein of Denmark, is said to have abandoned her Swedish husband to avoid this fate, knowing he had vowed himself to Odin and did not have long to live. Whether fact or fiction, this account reflects a lingering belief in sacrificial death as part of Odin's worship. Such practices, whether based in literal rituals or shaped by myth, suggest that women too could claim a place in the afterlife, provided they died by fire or by violence. Many tales speak of sudden deaths from grief or deliberate suicides at funerals. In Saxo's history, the story of Signy and Hagbard shows how love and death were entwined. When Hagbard was to be executed, Signy kept her vow and set her home ablaze, hanging herself as the fire consumed it. Hagbard, seeing the smoke rise, knew she had kept her promise and met his own death with pride, speaking of love renewed in death. This idea, that death offered fulfillment denied in life, appears again and again. In Urvar Odd's saga, a woman dies upon hearing of her beloved's death with the words, "Now they shall enjoy in death what they could not have in life." In these stories, Odin's realm is not limited to men. It is open to any who meet death in a way that honors the god. Snorri, in his Ynglinga saga, offers another perspective. There he writes that all who were burned after death went to join Odin, and that this practice had been established by the god himself. The dead were to be marked with a spear, a sign of devotion, and their possessions were burned with them. Interestingly, this contradicts Snorri's own claims elsewhere that Valhalla was reserved only for those who fell in battle. The contradiction may suggest that Odin's cult was once more inclusive, or that over time, its rituals and meanings changed to suit evolving beliefs. Another striking part of the Valhalla myth is the idea of the never-ending battle. This vision appears in the poem Vafthrudnismal, and Snorri later integrated it into his own depiction of life in Odin's Hall. According to this tradition, warriors fight fiercely throughout the day, only to be revived by evening so they can enjoy a feast with Odin, ready to fight again the next morning. This grim image of the undead endlessly reliving combat echoes in magical tales across the Norse world, but isn't always directly linked to Odin or Valhalla. In the story of Hild, first mentioned in Ragnarok, the battlefield becomes eternal because Hild, torn between her father and lover, uses magic to continually resurrect the fallen. As a result, the conflict never ends. But perhaps the most fitting place for such scenes is not Odin's golden hall in the sky, but rather the underworld. In Saxo's history, the hero Hadding visits the realm of the dead and witnesses an endless battle. Two armies clash without rest, reenacting their violent ends. A similar vision appears in a burial mound described in Icelandic lore, where one group of warriors wears black and the other red, locked forever in combat. Only the Christian hero Thorstein is able to strike them with lasting effect, granting peace to those tormented souls. Even the Hall of the Slain that Odin rules in Grimnismal has more in common with a tomb than with heaven. In Saxo's Book 8, a long and shadowy description of a spear-roofed hall houses legions of the dead. This place, belonging to the giant Geirrod, is reached only by crossing the ocean, passing beyond the sun and stars, into a realm of complete darkness. It resembles not paradise, but the kingdom of death itself. Valhalla, then, might be less a shining reward and more a poetic expression of the grave, a vision elaborated by poets and reinterpreted by Snorri. As the god of the dead, Odin ruled this shadowy realm, and perhaps his earlier form, Woden, did too. Because warriors who died in battle were dedicated to him, It's no surprise that the warlike aspect of his kingdom became central in later stories. At the same time, other poetic traditions seem to have imagined a different kind of afterlife, one of honor and brightness, where the noblest dead were welcomed as guests of the gods. In Eiríksmal and Hakonarmal, both 10th century poems, fallen kings are greeted by Valkyries and led to Odin's hall with reverence. This dual image, one of shadow and one of glory, helps explain the contrasting visions of Valhalla we find in the sagas. There are also curious connections between Odin and the Vanir gods, despite their cults often being viewed as separate or even opposed. Skadi, the wife of Njord, is said to have borne children to Odin. Odin is frequently mentioned alongside Freya. And then there is Odd, a mysterious double of Odin, said to have been Freya's husband, whom she mourned deeply when he left her. These overlapping associations suggest that Odin and Freyr may have been worshipped side by side, especially in places like the Great Temple at Uppsala, where Swedish kings honored both gods. Over time, especially in the final days of pagan belief, boundaries between deities likely blurred, and the powers of the Vanir and Aesir began to intertwine. The Vanir, too, were linked to the realm of the dead. Their mythology connects them with burial mounds, with funeral ships, and with journeys across the sea to the land beyond life. Freyr himself is said to have been buried in a mound, where people brought offerings. A door was built into the mound so that the living could enter, and wooden figures were kept inside. The mound became not just a grave, but a dwelling, a place where the dead resided and could still interact with the world. This idea appears in many sagas. Sometimes it's shown in simple or humorous ways, like a Christian hermit's ghost scolding a girl for wiping her muddy feet on his grave, calling it his house. In other stories, people are buried in high places so they can overlook the land they ruled. Friends are imagined chatting between nearby burial mounds, or the dead rise from their graves in more terrifying forms, as Draugr, undead beings who haunt the living and bring ruin. One of the most evocative images of the dead comes from Njál's saga. After the warrior Gunnar is killed, a dream reveals him resting peacefully in his grave. The mound appears open, and Gunnar is seen gazing at the moon with a joyful face, surrounded by a gentle light, calm and content. Yet the dead were not always at peace. Icelandic tales often speak of hauntings and terrifying apparitions. But sometimes, the dead were seen as protectors, or even as returning gods. A Norwegian king named Olaf Geirstad Elf was honored long after death. During a famine, people sacrificed to him in his mound, just as they once did to Freyr. When Olaf the Holy was born generations later, he was named after this ancestor and received his ring and sword, said to have been taken from the old king's grave. Many believed the new Olaf was the old one reborn. Yet Olaf the Holy rejected this idea. As he passed the ancient mound, a companion asked if he had once been buried there. The king sternly denied it, insisting his soul had never had two bodies, and never would. He spurred his horse forward and rode away quickly, clearly shaken. One theory suggests that it was the earlier Olaf, the one worshipped after death, who may have been buried in the Gokstad shipgrave, one of Norway's most iconic pagan burial sites. If true, this would deepen the connection between Olaf and the Vanir, especially given the strong fertility themes present in stories about sacrifices made to him. The focus on ancestor worship in these accounts closely mirrors the cult of Freyr. Rather than promising an afterlife in a distant world of the gods, the Vanir-centered belief system emphasized honoring the dead, remembering them during rituals and festivals, visiting their graves, and even sitting upon their mounds to gain wisdom and insight. Legends about peaceful kings arriving over the sea and passing on their rule speak to a tradition not of resurrection in a divine realm, but of rebirth and continuity within this world. The title Elf, carried by Olaf and his ancestor Halfdan Whiteleg, may hold important meaning. Halfdan is listed under that name in the poem Ynglingatal, which traces the burial places of early kings. The tradition of honoring elves persisted in Sweden well into the late Viking Age. In fact, Sigvat, a Christian poet serving King Olaf the Holy, once wrote about his journey through Sweden in 1018. He couldn't find lodging in Gotland because, at that time of year, the locals were holding sacrifices to the elves. In Cormac's saga, an Icelandic tale, a woman with mystical powers instructs a wounded man to sacrifice a bull at a burial mound inhabited by elves. She tells him to smear the mound with the animal's blood and prepare a feast using the meat. Only then, she says, will he be healed. This ritual parallels sacrifices to Freyr mentioned in other sagas, where oxen were offered in his name. Freyr himself is said to live in Alfheim, the land of the elves, and both he and the elves are symbolically connected to the sun. Ancient cup marks carved into stones and tombs in Sweden, often paired with sun wheels, appear to reflect this connection. Even in more recent times, Swedish villagers have poured milk into these cups as offerings to the elves. These practices and symbols tie the elves not only to nature and fertility, but also to the spirits of the dead resting in the earth. An Old English charm that speaks of sharp, stabbing pain attributes the cause to arrows shot by gods, witches, or elves. While this highlights the elves' potential to harm, many sagas suggest that their power was often sought for aid, especially for healing and childbirth. One compelling example comes from the story of Olaf the Holy's birth. His mother struggled with a long and painful labor. Only when a sacred belt from Olaf of Gerstad's burial mound was placed around her did the pain subside. The sword from that same mound was then given to the newborn child, future king and saint of Norway, sealing the belief that help from the dead could lead to life. Beyond healing, inspiration was also believed to flow from the burial mounds. According to a story in Flateyjarbók, a man gained the gift of poetry after sleeping on a poet's grave. In a dream, the spirit of the dead bard taught him a verse, and from that moment, he became a poet himself. This power did not come from Odin, the god traditionally associated with wisdom and poetry, but from the unseen forces beneath the ground, those aligned with the Vanir. It's worth recalling that even Odin himself did not originally possess the mead of poetic inspiration. He had to steal it from the giants, and its creation was deeply tied to the Vanir. There are stories of kings sitting atop the burial mounds of their ancestors, seeking wisdom from those buried beneath. In many ways, this tradition echoes the belief that true knowledge and guidance could be drawn directly from the spirits of the dead. Such acts suggest that the earth itself and those within it were sources of sacred power and insight. Some tales go even further, describing the living entering burial mounds and joining the dead. These stories seem more closely tied to the memory of the Vanir than to Odin's cult. A striking example is found in the poem Helgakvida, where the princess Sigrun willingly steps into the grave of her fallen husband, Helgi. There, in the shadow of death, she embraces him once more. Notes attached to the poem hint that these two lovers were believed to be reborn again and again, returning to life more than once. This view of death, where love leads to rebirth, differs from the traditions linked to Odin. In stories of Odin's cult, widows often died by strangulation and were burned alongside their husbands, not to return to this world, but to join their men in the afterlife of the gods. This contrast may shed light on an odd line about Brynhild in the poetic Edda. As she prepares to die alongside Sigurd, her words reflect a desire to ensure that she will not be born again. Although Thor is rarely connected with death in the surviving myths, archaeological evidence tells another story. Across the north, the symbol of the hammer, or swastika, appears on cremation urns and memorial stones, suggesting that Thor was believed to protect his followers even in death. Both cremation and burial practices seem to have been tied to his cult. Given his association with lightning and fire, it is not surprising that cremation may have once played a role. Still, by the later Viking Age, most of Thor's followers were buried in the earth. Cremation, on the other hand, lingered mainly in Sweden and was more closely linked to the worship of Odin. Unlike Freyr, Thor is not known for traditions of burial in mounds. There are no stories of his death or the establishment of funeral rites in his name. Yet there is one powerful example from Icelandic tradition. Thorolf of Most, a devoted follower of Thor, was believed not to have remained in his grave after death. Instead, his family held the belief that he entered the nearby mountains. This belief is echoed in Eyrbyggja saga, where a shepherd reported seeing the sacred hill Holyfell opened after the death of Thorolf's son. He claimed to witness the son and his crew being joyfully received into the mountain by Thorolf himself. Similar beliefs are mentioned in other Icelandic sources, always in relation to people connected to Thorolf by blood or marriage. It seems likely this was a family belief, possibly brought from Norway by Thorolf during the early days of Icelandic settlement. When Thorolf arrived in Iceland, he built a temple dedicated to Thor and declared the hill Holyfell to be sacred. No one was to gaze upon it unwashed, and no living being was to be harmed upon its slopes. Those who lived under Thor's protection were believed to pass into this holy hill after death. This idea highlights the strong ties between the living and their ancestors. Much like the burial mound or the mythic journey across the sea, this belief centered not on the fate of the individual, but on the survival of the family line and the sanctity of the land tied to them. Thor's worship, like that of Freyr, was deeply rooted in settled agricultural life. This contrasts with the cult of Odin, whose rites of cremation often took place on distant battlefields, far from home. No exploration of death in Germanic mythology would be complete without the haunting figure of the fiery dragon. In the Old English poem Beowulf, the dragon is a monstrous guardian of the grave mound, curled around ancient treasure, consumed by a furious need to protect it. When a single cup is stolen from his hoard, his fury is unleashed. He rises and sets the countryside ablaze, laying waste to the homes of men with his flaming breath. He circles the land, bringing fire and death to all in his path. In the final act of the poem, Beowulf confronts the dragon to protect his people. Though he slays the beast, the battle costs him his own life. This terrifying image of the dragon is reinforced by archaeological finds. At Sutton Hoo, the design on a royal shield features a fearsome dragon with sharp teeth, folded wings, and a coiled tail. Even historical accounts support this imagery. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 793 records fiery dragons seen in the sky, considered ominous signs of coming disaster. These were likely aurora displays, but the specific association with dragons suggests a deeper cultural symbol. The dragon as a manifestation of devouring death, consuming both the body and the treasures of the dead. Excavations from places like Asthall Barrow in Oxfordshire show that cremation burials were practiced well into the 7th century. Beowulf offers a vivid picture of such a funeral pyre. The flames roar into the sky, splitting open wounds and consuming the fallen. Fire, described as the greediest of spirits, devours the bodies of the slain, reducing them to ash. Even after cremation was no longer the standard practice, fire retained its role in funerary rites. At early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries like Stappenhill in Staffordshire and Kettering, some inhumation graves show signs of ritual burning, charcoal and scorched earth surrounding the bodies. In other sites on the European continent, similar evidence has been found. At Villers-Saint-Étienne in France, archaeologists uncovered signs of ceremonial fires within Alemannic burial grounds. Later, Christian practices absorbed this symbolism. Charcoal and even incense were placed into graves to signify spiritual cleansing. Whether these earlier fire rites were tied to the worship of Thor or Odin remains unclear, but the symbolic power of fire clearly endured. In Scandinavian mythology, dragons play a smaller role, and when they do appear, they are often described as serpents rather than fire-breathing beasts. Unlike the vivid, airborne dragons of Anglo-Saxon legend, Norse dragons are earthbound, lurking in mounds. The idea of the fire-breathing dragon may have developed from rituals around the grave and was given dramatic life by artists and poets. In Beowulf, the dragon is brought so vividly to life that he seems almost real, a being who walks among men. Over time, in both England and Scandinavia, dragons came to symbolize the guardianship of tombs. In some legends, the dragon is said to be the very spirit of the dead man, transformed after burial to protect his hoard. The most enduring image remains that of the dragon as death itself, consuming, hoarding, watching. This idea appears in burial art as well. At the Alemannic cemetery of Oberflacht, tree-trunk coffins were carved with serpent dragons stretching across their lids, as if triumphing over the dead inside. The Old Norse poem Völuspa speaks of Nidugr, the corpse devourer, who soars through the sky carrying the dead. His name alone makes it clear. He is a creature of death, destruction, and decay. The winged dragon may have come from the east, carried into Europe alongside Roman legions who bore the flying dragon as a military standard. Yet it found fertile ground in the north because it resonated with existing beliefs about death. The coiled serpent dragon, like Fafnir slain by Sigurd, left its mark on Viking art as well, etched into rune stones, coiling around graves. Again and again, the snake appears as a symbol of death's domain, both in myth and in stone. In the prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson describes the underworld ruled by Hel as a bleak and shadowy place. This version, though carefully crafted in literary terms, is far removed from older, rawer depictions found in earlier poetry and chronicles. There, the grave is not just a final resting place. It is a realm of dread, filled with corpses, serpents, stench, bitter cold, and rotting treasures. These images appear not only in the Edda poems, but also in the works of Saxo Grammaticus. While sometimes associated with punishment for sin, they carry a primal force of their own, independent of Christian notions of hell. The fear of consuming fire and the suffocating embrace of the grave haunted the northern imagination, and the comfort offered by the gods could never fully dispel it. The solutions proposed by the gods varied. Odin offered the gift of temporary forgetfulness. Freyr promised hope in rebirth and the continuation of the family line. Thor provided strength and a sense of order. Yet none of these were enough to erase the looming threat of death or the monsters that symbolized it. The myth of Ragnarok makes this fear unmistakably clear. In the end, even the gods fall victim to the same fate as mortals. The death of Balder is particularly telling. When he died, Odin sent his horse Sleipnir into the underworld to retrieve him. Balder was found in Hel's Hall, but the attempt to bring him back ended in failure. He was never restored to life, and poetic evidence shows that this wasn't an invention of Snorri, but an older tradition. Balder, son of Odin, symbolized the bitter truth that even divine lineage could not escape mortality. The god of death himself, in a cruel twist, was powerless against death. Looking across the northern Pantheon, three towering figures emerge above all others: Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Freya, sister of Freyr, stands proudly among them, while Frigg, Odin's wife, remains a more elusive and shadowy presence. Njord, father of Freyr, and Tyr, once a mighty war god, also linger in the background. When we examine the Germanic world beyond Scandinavia, we find similar deities: Woden, Donar, Nerthus, and Tiwaz, reflections of these great northern gods. But these are not the only inhabitants of Asgard. In Snorri's account, many other figures appear, some only briefly mentioned, others playing more active roles in myth. Yet few of them seem to have been worshipped in any structured cult. If we try to categorize them simply as literary inventions, they remain confusing and inconsistent. Some appear to be tied to the older Vanir cult, such as Ing, Scyld, Njord's children, and the goddesses Gefjon and Skadi. Others may have been mortal heroes who were elevated to divine status over time. A few may have originated as poetic abstractions that slowly took on lives of their own. Some, it's believed, were foreign imports, introduced into the North and absorbed into myth through storytelling and poetic tradition. Among these lesser figures, three stand out: Heimdall, Loki, and Balder. Another is Bragi, whom Snorri calls the god of poetry. In Lokasenna, Loki mocks Bragi for avoiding battle and choosing instead to hide among the benches, perhaps a poetic jab at his quiet nature. Yet Bragi is also portrayed in court poetry as a noble figure, welcoming slain kings to Valhalla and preparing Odin's hall for their arrival. In one tale, Loki even accuses him of killing his wife's brother, suggesting that other, now lost myths once existed about him. There was also a real poet named Bragi Boddason in the 9th century, and while it is unlikely he became a mythological god, the name Bragi may have originally been a title or nickname. The word itself can mean poetry, and Bragarmal refers to poetic speech. According to Snorri, this meaning came from the god's name, but linguistically it could have been the reverse. The word also means leader or chief, and the term Bragarfull, the cup of Bragi, was the ceremonial drink shared at a dead king's funeral feast, a cup over which men might swear solemn oaths. This cup may have been named not after the god Bragi, but after the fallen leader or even Odin himself as Lord of the Dead. Bragi, sometimes known as the Long-Bearded One, may simply be a poetic reflection of Odin, the god of poetry and inspiration, whose many names and roles might have been misunderstood or fragmented into separate divine figures. His association with Valhalla feasts could be explained by the connection to this funeral tradition. Bragi's wife was the goddess Idun, keeper of the magical apples that granted the gods eternal youth. Snorri tells the story of how Loki, under pressure, was forced to kidnap Idun and her apples for the giant Thiazi, and later had to retrieve them to save the gods from aging. Idun herself is a quiet figure in myth, mentioned little outside this tale. Though her brother appears in Lokasenna, hinting at other lost stories, she seems somewhat foreign to the native mythology of the North. Some scholars suggest she may have been borrowed from Celtic or classical myths. Her golden apples recall those found in the Garden of the Hesperides. In Irish legend, too, apples and nuts grant immortality, youth, and freedom from time's grip. These images are ancient and deeply symbolic. In one tale, Loki transforms Idun and her apples into a nut, then escapes with her while in the form of a bird. Here, the motif of nuts and apples as sources of eternal youth appears once more, a concept long familiar in Celtic tradition, and one that suggests a deeper cross-cultural symbolism behind Idun's role in Norse mythology. The symbolic link between fruit, especially apples, and the divine may already have existed in early Germanic paganism. Archaeological finds reveal that fruit and nuts were sometimes buried with the dead in early graves across southern England and the European continent, hinting at a possible ritual or symbolic meaning. Even today, nuts are still associated with fertility in parts of southwestern England. In Norse mythology, the connection is clearer. Golden apples were the gifts offered by Skirnir to Gerd when he courted her on behalf of Freyr, a prominent god among the Vanir. In another mythic tale from the Volsung cycle, the goddess Frigg gave an apple to a king praying for a son while sitting atop a sacred mound. An 11th century poem by Thorbjorn Brunnerson introduces the haunting phrase, "apples of hell." In the poem, the speaker accuses his wife of wishing for his death, offering him apples that would send him to the realm of the dead. This poetic image suggests that, by that time, apples were being imagined not only as symbols of life, but also as food for the dead. Further supporting this connection is the Roman-era goddess Nehelenia, often depicted seated with a bowl of apples at her side. Her cult, associated with the goddesses of fertility and abundance, bears strong ties to the Vanir, suggesting that the apple's symbolism may have deep roots in northern religious traditions. While it's tempting to view the Norse use of apples as influenced by Celtic myths, especially the Irish story of the sons of Tuireann, where magical fruit is stolen from a divine tree, there's a key difference. In the Norse tale of Idun, the apples are not plucked from a tree but carried in a box or bowl, taken along with her when she is abducted. The concept of a sacred fruit offering immortality is much older and likely originated in the Near East, where apple cultivation first began. Though apples were introduced to northern Europe by the Romans, native varieties were small and sour. Still, the myth of Idun, paired with the god of poetry and inspiration, may preserve the faint echo of an ancient figure, the life-giving goddess who guarded the sacred fruit of the otherworld. Another deeply symbolic figure is Mimir, often described as the wisest among the Aesir gods. Snorri Sturluson portrays him as the guardian of a sacred spring beneath the world tree, located in the realm of the frost giants. According to another tradition, Mimir was given as a hostage to the Vanir and was later killed by them. Odin, however, preserved his head and used it as an oracle, seeking counsel from it during times of great uncertainty. Mimir's name appears in several variations: Mimir, Mimir, Mimi, all tied to the themes of wisdom and divine knowledge. Some have even connected his name to the Latin word memor, meaning mindful, though other linguistic roots have also been suggested. The story of Mimir's death stems from a mythic war between the Aesir and the Vanir. The version we have tells of Mimir being paired with Honir, a companion who said little, leading the Vanir to become dissatisfied and ultimately to execute Mimir. While the tale is confusing, the idea of two rival groups of gods in conflict is common across many mythologies. Some scholars interpret it as a reflection of competing cults or belief systems. Georges Dumézil, a renowned mythologist, proposed that the myth represents a deeper division between gods of fertility and gods of magic. He pointed to Celtic myths, such as the war between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians, as evidence of a similar pattern. In both versions of the War of the Gods preserved by Snorri, the outcome is the same: the acquisition of inspiration by Odin and the Aesir. This suggests, if Dumézil is correct, that the gods of magic ultimately triumphed over the gods of fertility. In one version, inspiration is gained through Mimir's head. In the other, it comes from the mead brewed from the body of Kvasir. The figure of Kvasir adds another layer of complexity. Though he too is described as incredibly wise, his origins differ. His name derives from a term for fermented drink, used across Germanic and Eastern regions, and in modern Danish still refers to crushed fruit. Kvasir was born from the mingled saliva of the Aesir and the Vanir, representing their peace treaty. While unsettling to modern ears, the use of saliva may point to ancient fermentation practices. Kvasir, like the folkloric figure of John Barleycorn, came to represent the life force of the harvest, sacrificed to produce the drink that brings wisdom and fellowship. Though Kvasir faded into poetic abstraction, Mimir remained firmly rooted as the guardian of the sacred spring. According to one poem, Odin was granted access to this spring only after sacrificing one of his eyes, a steep price for the wisdom he sought. If Mimir once held the power of inspiration before the Aesir rose to dominance, his original identity may belong not among the gods, but among the giants. In several old verses, a terrifying giant is mentioned in connection with the World Tree, sometimes referred to as the Tree of Mimi, and this being is associated with powerful magical weapons. Saxo Grammaticus also preserved a tale in which the hero Hadding journeys to the underworld in search of a magical sword. There, the weapon is guarded by an old forest-dwelling figure named Mimingus, described as a satyr or woodland spirit. This character may be another echo of Mimir, a forgotten shadow of the once powerful giant guardian of knowledge and weapons. In these murky layers of legend, the true figure of Mimir becomes difficult to discern. Yet even in this obscured form, he continues to embody the ancient link between wisdom, sacrifice, and the deeper powers that lie beneath the surface of the world. Honir, the quiet companion of Mimir, has all but faded into mythic obscurity. Over time, scholars have tried to link him with better-known gods, but none of these identifications have proven convincing. And yet, Honir seems to have been more than the simple, silent figure described by Snorri in the story of the Aesir-Vanir truce. He is counted among the gods who helped create humanity, and in one of the earliest poems, he is said to have given humans the gift of intelligence. Remarkably, Honir is one of the few gods who is said to survive Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods, and to reign in the renewed world that follows. He was remembered as a companion of both Odin and Loki, and according to Snorri, he was swift and long-legged. Another prose source portrays him as timid, the most hesitant of the gods. But perhaps the silence that defined Honir was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. In Old Norse tradition, silence was often associated with insight and the power of foresight. It is possible that Honir once represented a form of mystical wisdom, now lost in the mists of forgotten lore. His silence, once his strength, has become the very thing that obscures him. There is evidence suggesting that early Germanic peoples worshipped a pair of divine twins, brothers born of the sky god. Though their names are now lost, this pattern appears in mythologies across Europe. The most well-known example comes from Greek and Roman tradition. Castor and Pollux, sons of Zeus, celebrated as the saviors of those in peril, whether at sea or in battle. The Spartans honored them especially, and their symbol, the dokana, two vertical beams joined by a crossbeam, may have represented fire, unity, or divine aid. In the 3rd century, Greek geographers reported that the cult of divine twins existed along the North Sea coast. The Roman historian Tacitus described a Germanic tribe, the Naharvali, who worshipped youthful twin gods he called the Alcis. These gods bore no images, but were honored in forest sanctuaries by priests dressed in women's garments. Tacitus himself believed this was not a Roman imitation, but a native Germanic tradition. Supporting this, archaeologists have found a Latin period urn from the same region, decorated with pairs of horsemen tied together by a beam, a striking echo of the dokana. We know very little about the later history of the Alcis. However, many Germanic royal families trace their origins to twin brothers. The Vandals spoke of Raus and Raptos, the Lombards of Ebor and Io. Among the early Swedes, legends recall brother kings like Alric and Eirik, or Alf and Yngvi. Even the Anglo-Saxon founders of Kent, Hengist and Horsa, whose names mean stallion and horse, evoke the imagery of mounted divine twins. These equine associations strengthen the idea that such legends may preserve a distant memory of the horse-riding savior gods, like the Dioscuri. In some cases, one brother kills the other, as with Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome. Similar stories survive in the traditions of Swedish kings. In Scandinavia, there were also the mysterious Haddingjar, brothers remembered in fragments of legend. Place names in Norway still bear traces of them, and their name may be connected to the Hasdingi, the royal house of the Vandals. The Old Norse word hadr, meaning women's hair, might echo Tacitus's description of the Alcis priests dressed like women. These linguistic and mythic hints suggest a shared cultural memory of divine twins. Yet most of this remains scholarly reconstruction. What matters more is whether any trace of these heavenly brothers, these divine protectors, can still be found in Norse mythology. Some believe they might survive in figures like Njord and Freyr, or Freyr and Ullr, gods of the Vanir. But whatever presence they once had has largely been eclipsed by the rise of major gods like Thor, Freyr, and Odin, or perhaps by powerful goddesses. There are tantalizing signs. Hakon, a Norse earl of Halogaland, prayed in battle to the goddess Thorgerda. In one tale, she appeared in the sky alongside her sister Irpa, firing arrows at his enemies. This mirrors the behavior of the Dioscuri, appearing from above to protect their followers. In another strange account from Saxo Grammaticus, as Swedes and Danes waged war, two bald old men appeared in the night sky. One fought for the Swedes, the other for the Danes. Their grotesque, unnatural appearance and their supernatural efforts suggest they were more than human. But nowhere in these tales do we find the clear, vivid image known from Greco-Roman myth. Two radiant young horsemen, riding side by side, arriving in the moment of need. By the time Snorri collected the Old Norse stories, It seems the divine twins, the Alces, had long since faded from northern memory. Snorri Sturluson mentions Forseti as the son of Balder and lists him among the gods of Asgard. In the poem Grimnismal, Forseti is said to dwell in a shining hall of silver and gold called Glitnir, a place where he brings peace and resolves conflicts. Although some scholars believe this part of the poem might be a late addition, Forseti stands out because he is linked to more than one tradition. One such tradition comes from the life of Saint Willibrord, written in the 8th century. In this account, Willibrord visited an island somewhere between Frisia and Denmark. This island had a sacred spring where silence was required to draw water. Willibrord baptized 3 men there and even slaughtered a cow, acts which defiled the sacred place. Despite this, he escaped execution by the local king, Radbod, because 3 times the lots were drawn, and each time he was spared, although one of his companions was not so fortunate. The island was known as Faucet's Land, named after the god once worshipped there. Interestingly, there is also a place called Forsetlund, near the Oslo fjord, suggesting that Forseti's cult may have once reached into Norway from the Frisian coast. Another story from Frisian legend tells how the laws of Frisia were first recorded. When Charlemagne summoned 12 Frisian representatives to recite their laws, they failed. As punishment, he gave them a grim choice: death, slavery, or to be cast adrift in a boat with no rudder. They chose the last option and prayed for divine help. Their prayers were answered when a 13th man appeared, carrying a golden axe. He steered their vessel, and as they approached land, he threw the axe ashore. From the spot it landed, a spring emerged. This mysterious figure taught the men the laws they needed, and then vanished. Though this tale has clear Christian overtones, some scholars believe it preserves elements of an older pagan story, perhaps linked to Forseti. The golden axe might echo the precious metals associated with him, and the act of bringing forth a spring is reminiscent of his sacred island. The number of 12 men accompanied by a divine leader is not necessarily a Christian influence, as councils of 12 are well documented in northern traditions. Even Odin was said to have led such a council. The axe itself, not a traditional Christian symbol, and the motif of a spring appearing from the earth support a pre-Christian origin for this tale. However, there is no consensus on whether these stories truly reflect an ancient cult of Forseti. As with many lesser-known gods, some have attempted to link him to more prominent figures, but none of these theories have held up convincingly. Unlike the elusive Forseti or Hunir, Heimdall presents a much more distinct and fascinating figure. He appears across many sources as a powerful, mysterious deity with a unique and striking presence. Yet even with the wealth of references, Heimdall defies easy categorization. Scholars have tried to fit him into various roles, as a god of the sun, the moon, the ram, or even as a divine bird. Others see him as a guardian spirit, a personification of the rainbow, a symbol of ritual silence, or even as a representation of the world tree. Comparisons have ranged from Agni, the Indian fire god, to Saint Michael, to Christ himself. Despite all these interpretations, none fully captures the complexity of Heimdall's character. One aspect of Heimdall stands out above all others. He is the Watcher. Snorri describes him sitting at the edge of heaven, guarding the rainbow bridge, Bifrost. He never sleeps, sees as clearly by night as by day, and can hear even the faintest sound. He carries Gjallarhorn, the horn that will one day signal the doom of the gods. In the poem Lokasenna, Loki mocks this constant vigilance, while in Völuspá, Heimdall's horn becomes the trumpet of Ragnarok, waking the gods as their final battle begins. Some have argued that this horn is a later Christian addition, inspired by the Archangel Gabriel. However, a 10th century stone cross in Gosforth, England, shows a figure holding a horn among scenes depicting the end of the gods, suggesting that the horn was already part of the tradition by then. The idea that Heimdall simply copied Gabriel doesn't account for his deep role in Norse myth, or why he was the one chosen to sound the horn of doom. A theory proposed by Finnish scholar Pipping connects Heimdall to the ram, noting that one version of his name, Heimdalli, means ram. This interpretation tries to make sense of two unusual poetic kennings mentioned by Snorri, that a sword can be called Heimdall's head, and that a head can be called Heimdall's sword. If these phrases are based on ancient myths, those stories are now lost. Some have speculated that Heimdall, like a ram, might have symbolized sacrifice and rebirth. In this view, Heimdall could even be linked with the World Tree, hanging as a sacrificed guardian, a figure both sacred and watchful. Whatever the truth, Heimdall's image remains vivid, the sleepless sentinel at the edge of the world, listening for the approach of chaos, waiting with his horn to summon the gods to their fate. Some scholars have suggested that Heimdall might have deep-rooted connections to northeastern Europe, especially the Finno-Ugric tribes. In these cultures, gods were often represented by tall wooden pillars. Heimdall, known as the White God, is described as majestic and sacred. Interestingly, in the legends of the Yakut people, there is a white youth, considered the father of humankind, who was sustained by the spirit of the World Tree and nourished with milk. This idea likely has southern origins, linked with ancient images of life-giving trees that were central in Near Eastern mythologies. Yet, there are also features of Heimdall that suggest influences from the West. In the preface to the Eddic poem, Rígstula, Heimdall is identified with a mysterious figure called Rig. Though this name doesn't appear elsewhere, Rig plays a central role in the poem as the father of the human race. He travels across the earth, visiting 3 households, one of slaves, one of farmers, and one of nobles. In each home, he sleeps between the man and wife, and 9 months later, a child is born, each destined to become a representative of one of these social classes. The first becomes a thrall, the second a free land-owning farmer, and the third grows into a noble earl and leader. The story has clear echoes of Celtic tradition. The name Rig is likely related to the Irish word for king, and the theme of a god who travels among mortals to father children closely resembles legends about the sea god Manannan mac Lir and his son Mongan. Manannan, often linked with the Isle of Man, is known as the Son of the Sea, a title that could easily describe Heimdall too. In the lost poem Heimdall Argaldur, known only through Snorri's writings, Heimdall is said to be born of 9 mothers. These mothers appear to be sea giantesses, perhaps even personifications of the ocean's waves. In another poem, Heimdall is described as a being of immense strength, born long ago on the edge of the world to 9 giant maidens. These powerful women, living beneath the sea, are familiar figures in both Norse and Irish traditions. They are often tied to the underworld and possess immense strength and mystery. The poem continues with references to Heimdall being granted the power of the earth, the icy sea, and sacred swine's blood. Swine, especially the boar, were sacred to the Vanir gods like Freyr, who are themselves linked to the underworld and power. A strange phrase in the poem refers to Heimdall as nail resplendent, a term also used for a mighty underworld giant, the father of the necklace-loving maiden Menglod, who may be connected to Freya. These connections suggest that Heimdall is not only a guardian of the gods, but also tied to the Vanir and their deep associations with the sea, fertility, and the otherworld. Although the link between Heimdall and the Vanir is never directly stated, there are subtle hints throughout the myths. In Thrymskvida, Heimdall offers counsel on how to recover Freya from the giants, and here his wisdom seems to align with the Vanir. Like Freya, Heimdall is associated with the sea, and the Vanir's influence extended across both land and water. Heimdall is also said to have battled Loki, the trickster god. Their conflict is mentioned in the 10th century poem Haustlong, though the surviving text is vague and difficult to interpret. Some believe Heimdall emerged victorious, reclaiming a valuable treasure, perhaps even Brisingamen, the necklace of Freya, which Loki had once stolen. There is still much debate about Heimdall's role and origins. Unfortunately, the lost poem Heimdallargaldr might have offered valuable clarity, but it survives only in name. In Völuspá, the poem opens with a call to the sons of Heimdall, implying that mankind itself descends from him, much like in Rígstula. However, there is no known evidence of a specific cult devoted to Heimdall, and place names offer no clues either. Still, the wide variety of stories and references to Heimdall are difficult to dismiss. They suggest a figure too vivid and complex to be merely a poetic invention. His connections to the Vanir offer one of the most promising paths to understanding his role. As a guardian of Asgard, a child of the sea, a being tied to the world tree and the underworld, and ultimately, as a divine ancestor of humanity itself. Loki's place among the gods of Asgard is as mysterious as Heimdall's, but even more compelling. In Snorri's stories, Loki emerges as perhaps the most vivid and unforgettable character in Norse mythology. He is at the center of the most entertaining tales and often plays a critical role in the unfolding of events. He brings laughter to the divine world with his tricks and deception, but also sorrow, especially through his involvement in Baldur's death. Yet, when we look at the poetic sources, Loki becomes something else entirely. A darker, more elusive force. He appears powerful, shadowy, and dangerous. While Snorri often portrays him as wicked, the older poems suggest a more ambiguous nature. Some scholars even believe that Loki's role as Baldur's killer was a late development, shaped by growing Christian influence that gradually darkened his image, casting him more in line with the devil. One thing that makes Loki stand out is his constant presence among the gods. Only Odin and Thor are as socially active as he is. Loki is seen alongside almost every major figure in the Norse Pantheon. He journeys with Odin and Thor, quarrels with Heimdall, and causes the death of Baldur. He is part of both the creation of the world and its destruction. He helps construct the walls of Asgard and interacts with gods and monsters alike. Though scholars have tried to link him with a lesser-known creator god called Lotur, no strong connection has ever been established. Unlike other prominent deities, such as Freyr, Thor, or even Tyr, Loki was never worshipped by mortals. He has no temples, no cult, no trace of veneration in place names or rituals. He remains an essential part of the myths, but always as an outsider. Even in Snorri's more playful tales, Loki is more of a trickster than a villain. His schemes sometimes cause trouble for the gods, like when he helps a giant steal the apples of youth, or kills an otter without realizing its divine connections. But at other times, he is the one who saves the gods. He is the clever one who recovers Thor's stolen hammer by disguising the thunder god as a bride. His motives are not always clear. Sometimes he is forced to act under pressure, either by threats from giants or commands from the gods. Many of his misdeeds, like cutting off Sif's golden hair, feel more like pranks than acts of malice. While Loki is intelligent and inventive, his plans often go wrong. Loki's most unique gift is his ability to transform. This magical skill allows him to slip between worlds and roles. When the gods needed to stop a giant from finishing the walls of Asgard, Loki transformed into a mare and lured away the giant's horse. From this bizarre event, Loki gave birth to Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that would become Odin's steed. When the golden apples were stolen, Loki flew in bird form to retrieve them. On another mission, he borrowed Freya's feather cloak to find Thor's hammer. To sabotage a group of master blacksmiths, he turned into a fly and bit the craftsman at a key moment. In another tale, he became a flea to steal Freya's necklace. Some poems suggest he once fought Heimdall while transformed into a seal. And when the gods hunted him down for his role in Baldur's death, Loki turned into a salmon to escape. According to Snorri, he even took the shape of an old woman to stop Baldur from returning from the dead. Beyond this, Loki is also the father of many monstrous beings: Fenrir the wolf, Jörmungandr the world serpent, and Hel, the goddess of death. Through these children, Loki becomes deeply connected with chaos, destruction, and the shadowy forces that threaten the gods. This dark connection between Loki and monstrous beings is not new. Skaldic poetry from the 9th century already ties him to these creatures. Some have tried to explain this by linking it to medieval Christian writings about demons, but it's also possible that the Norse poets were drawing on authentic pagan traditions. Even the idea of Loki being bound after causing Baldur's death may have originated in pre-Christian mythology, although Christian ideas may have reinforced it. In Anglo-Saxon England, images of the devil being bound were popular in religious manuscripts. This theme was also carved into stones by Viking artists. Some Viking-era carvings in northern England show large bound figures that could easily be interpreted as either Loki or Satan. One of the clearest examples is the Gosforth Cross in Cumbria. On this stone cross, Loki is shown lying helpless while venom drips down onto him. A woman stands beside him, catching the poison in a bowl to protect him. This image closely matches the story of Loki's punishment, as told by Snorri. What makes the Gosforth Cross especially fascinating is that it combines symbols of both Norse mythology and Christian belief. Scenes of Heimdall blowing his horn and gods fighting the great serpent are mixed with visions of judgment and redemption. Loki, bound beneath the snake's venom, becomes a bridge between two worlds. He is both the trickster of the old faith and the devil of the new. Some scholars, like Ulrich, have even compared this story to ancient legends from the Caucasus, where a bound giant plays a similar role. While his broader conclusions may be debated, Ulrich's work highlights an important point. The image of a bound, monstrous figure existed long before Christianity. It was part of a shared cultural language in the North, and Loki may well have been its most vivid symbol. Jan de Vries spent considerable time analyzing the old sources that mention Loki. Many of these references are from later periods, and the stories they contain, especially those filled with Loki's mischief, appear to be later additions, likely created for the sake of entertainment. De Vries concluded that Loki's most ancient and consistent trait is his role as a thief. Time and again, Loki is seen stealing or hiding sacred objects: the apples of immortality, Thor's belt and gloves, Freya's necklace. These tales, even in early poetry, show that his reputation as a cunning thief was firmly established. Some scholars, like Georges Dumézil, go even further, arguing that Loki's image as a master thief may reach deep into Indo-European mythological roots. There have also been attempts to connect Loki with fire, mostly due to the similarity between his name and Logi, a personification of fire in Norse myth. But this connection doesn't hold up well. In Snorri's tale of Thor's journey to Utgard, Loki competes in an eating contest with Logi, who turns out to be literal wildfire. That scene might simply play on their similar names. In truth, Loki doesn't behave like a fire spirit. In fact, he's just as comfortable in water as he is on land. Some scholars have even proposed that Loki might be better understood as a water spirit, though this too remains uncertain. Efforts to place Loki among the ancient gods of the Germanic world haven't been particularly successful. One curious example comes from 19th century Lincolnshire, where a clergyman recalled a charm used by an old countrywoman when he was a child. The verse referenced three gods, God, Woden, and Loki, alongside a ritual involving a hammer. While it's tempting to view this as a lingering folk memory of a trio of Norse gods, Thor, Woden, and Loki, there are problems. The charm was recorded in several different versions, long after it was first heard, and without further supporting evidence, it remains a flimsy foundation for broader conclusions about Norse belief in England. Loki is a puzzling figure. He is a trickster, a liar, a thief, and a sharp-tongued troublemaker. In the Lokasenna poem, he shocks the gods and goddesses by hurling harsh truths and insults at them. Yet somehow, he still belongs in Asgard. He travels with Odin and Thor, joins in their adventures, and remains part of their world. To make sense of these contradictions, some scholars have compared Loki to the trickster figure found in many Native American traditions. This trickster is greedy and deceitful, often shifting into animal forms and getting involved in both comic and crude situations. But he's not merely a clown. Sometimes the trickster brings fire or light to humanity, or even creates aspects of the world itself. He can take both male and female forms, and even give birth. He's a strange mix of shaman, hero, god, and fool. This figure was beloved by storytellers, and often became the central character in folktales. Loki shares many of these traits, especially the harder-to-explain parts of his character. He too became the star of many humorous stories, most of them likely composed in later centuries simply to amuse an audience. In some versions of Native American tales, there are two creator figures, one noble and powerful, the other a trickster who tries to mimic him but always falls short. Loki, as a mischief maker and agent of chaos, could be seen as a kind of parody of Odin, the great creator. This perspective helps explain Loki's confusing place in the mythic world. Rather than being a straightforward villain, he becomes the shadow of the gods, especially Odin. There are hints that Loki may once have been associated with the underworld. He has deep ties to the realm of the dead, through his monstrous children like Hel, the serpent Jormungandr, and the wolf Fenrir. He also fathers Sleipnir, the horse that carries Odin to the world of the dead. At Ragnarok, Loki reappears alongside the giants, guiding their ship across the sea to battle the gods. In one poem, he is said to have forged a magical weapon beneath the doors of the dead. These connections suggest that Loki may have started as a chthonic figure, a spirit of the underworld with powers of deception and disguise. It's also worth remembering that there was another Loki in the myths, Utgard Loki. This giant lives far from Asgard, and Thor once visits him in a tale filled with trickery and illusion. Utgard Loki doesn't overpower Thor through strength, but through cunning and visual deception. While Thor is easily fooled, we suspect Odin would have seen through the illusions. Though presented as a comical story, it reflects a deeper truth. Loki and Thor are opposites. Loki is cunning, elusive, and magical. Thor is honest, strong, and direct. Their rivalry appears again in a different story told by Saxo, where travelers enter the realm of a terrifying giant who lies bound in darkness, much like Loki, within a land of rot, ruin, and death. Any full understanding of Loki must take into account his connection with death. He may have started as a dark, underground being who later evolved into a sly trickster, mocking the gods and upsetting their plans. In Snorri's stories, he is the clever troublemaker tagging along behind Odin and Thor, always causing problems but rarely being cast out. It's only at the end of the world, at Ragnarok, that his true nature is revealed. Loki breaks free from his chains and leads the forces of destruction. The mischievous jester of the gods becomes something else entirely, a terrifying giant, bent on ending everything. And in that final moment, all his masks fall away. Loki the Joker, the liar, the shadow of Odin, returns to what he was from the beginning, a force of chaos and doom. The last of the mysterious Norse gods we turn to is Balder, whose story is so closely tied to Loki that it's impossible to consider one without the other. Unlike Heimdall, whose nature seems scattered, or Loki, whose personality is full of contradictions, the mystery of Balder lies in the fact that we have two completely different accounts of his death, one from Snorri and the other from Saxo. What complicates the matter further is the lack of solid evidence that Balder was ever widely worshipped. Most of what we know about him seems to come from literary sources and traditions, rather than active religious belief. One of the earliest references to Balder appears in the second Merseburg charm, where he is mentioned alongside names like Fol and Woden. The charm tells of Balder's horse injuring its foot and a group of goddesses and gods chanting spells to heal it. But this brief mention doesn't necessarily mean that Balder was known as a major god in old Germanic tradition. It's possible that Balder was just a title, meaning lord, rather than a unique divine figure. Alternatively, he could have been a heroic character helped by gods. His name also appears in early Anglo-Saxon royal genealogies in the form Baldeg, which some have translated as bright day. This has led to theories that he was a sky god, a radiant figure of light and beauty. But all of this remains guesswork. There is no direct proof that myths about Balder as a god were told in pagan England or among the continental Germanic peoples. In early Norse poetry, Balder's name often serves as a poetic term for a warrior, and it's in this form that he appears in Saxo's account. Saxo describes Balder as a mighty warrior of divine origin, said to be born from celestial seed. While Snorri's version of Balder's story is more famous and refined, Saxo's cannot be ignored. Snorri's tale presents Balder as the beloved son of Odin, so pure and radiant that all things in the world agreed never to harm him. His mother Frigg had secured oaths from everything, except one small plant, mistletoe, which she had overlooked. Loki discovered this weakness and manipulated the blind god Hoder into throwing a mistletoe dart, striking Balder and killing him. Later, when the gods tried to bring Balder back from the realm of the dead, Loki again intervened, this time in disguise, and sabotaged their efforts, ensuring Balder remained in Hell. Saxo's version, while different, still retains echoes of the supernatural. In his story, Balder is supported by a group of otherworldly women, most likely Valkyries, who feed him a magical food that makes him nearly invincible. This food had been tainted by serpent venom, adding to its eerie power. Baldur's rival is the human warrior Hödur, who also seeks the hand of the maiden Nanna. Like Baldur, Hödur encounters the mystical women, who help him as well, even giving him a powerful belt that could ensure his victory in battle. Eventually, Hödur learns that in order to defeat Baldur, he must find a legendary sword, one guarded by a strange forest being named Mimingus. To obtain this weapon, Hödur embarks on a long and dangerous journey through a shadowy land that seems to resemble the underworld. He surprises Mimingus, defeats him, and claims the enchanted sword. What follows are a series of battles between Hödur and Baldur, though Saxo may have repeated the same event in slightly different forms. At one point, despite the support of the gods, Baldur suffers defeat, and his fleet is forced to retreat. At another moment, he finds victory and miraculously uncovers a spring of fresh water to relieve his warrior's thirst. A spring Saxo claimed was still known in his time as Baldur's Spring. Despite Baldur's temporary successes, Hödur eventually marries Nanna, and Baldur, heartbroken, begins to waste away. He is carried around in a wagon, visibly weakened. The final confrontation comes when Hödur, now armed with the magical sword, wounds Baldur. The next day, they fight one last battle. Baldur, now gravely injured, is brought to the battlefield on a litter. In a dream, he sees the goddess Proserpina, who predicts his death. 3 days later, he succumbs to the wound. Baldur is buried with great honor in a massive burial mound. According to legend, a man named Harold attempted to rob the grave centuries later, but was nearly drowned when a stream burst forth from the hill, forcing him to flee. After that, the mound was left untouched. Odin, devastated by the death of his son, was determined to take revenge. He sought out a princess named Rind, and through a strange and unsettling series of events, he fathered a son named Baus. When Baus reached adulthood, he fulfilled his destiny. He found Hödur on the battlefield and killed him in combat, avenging the fallen Baldur. At first glance, the two major versions of Baldur's death appear wildly different. On one side, we have the Icelandic tradition, recorded by Snorri. On the other, the Danish account compiled by Saxo. Each writer seems to be drawing from different traditions or interpreting their sources in unique ways, perhaps even misunderstanding or reshaping them. Scholars have long debated the origins of these stories, whether they stemmed from oral poetry or prose sagas. It's likely that Saxo was influenced by a saga about Hödur, since his version of the story is told largely from Hödur's perspective. Saxo's description of the underworld journey suggests he drew inspiration from a type of poetic tradition similar to other mythological poems that focus on magical journeys and enchanted weapons. Meanwhile, Snorri seems to have drawn on a different poetic source, especially one that describes Hermod's daring ride across the Bridge of the Dead to Hel's realm. Unfortunately, the other surviving Norse poems offer little help in clarifying the full story. Only the poem Lokasenna gives us any real support for Snorri's claim that Loki caused Baldur's death, where Loki tells Frigg that because of him, Baldur will never return. However, Lokasenna is not considered an early source. In another poem, there is a brief mention of Baldur as a sacrificial figure struck down by Hödur. One of the most striking accounts comes from the poem Baldur's Dreams, where Odin travels to the land of the dead to ask a long-buried seeress why Baldur has been having disturbing visions. The seeress tells him that Baldur's doom is near, that he will be killed by Hödur. and that Hodor will soon be slain by a son of Odin, yet to be born, whose mother will be Rind. In a different poem, composed to honor a fallen Norse king, the clamor of the dead arriving in Valhalla is compared to the sound of Balder returning to the gods' hall. Apart from the later poem Lokasenna, there is little in the older sources that contradicts the version of the tale in Saxo. In fact, Saxo's account of Balder dying after a battle lines up more closely with some of the scattered poetic clues. In Snorri's story, when Hermod visits the land of the dead, the guardian of the bridge tells him that the day Balder passed by, the bridge echoed with the footsteps of many slain warriors, 5 entire war bands entering hell. This suggests that Balder did not die alone, but was part of a mass death in battle. Looking more closely, the two stories share more common ground than it first seems. In both, Balder dreams of his coming death. In both, he is deeply cherished by Odin and the other gods. Supernatural beings aid or hinder him, and in both accounts, he is eventually killed by Hodor. Both agree that Balder could not be harmed by ordinary weapons, and that a special weapon was needed to bring him down. Odin is struck by terrible grief and loss. A new son of Odin is destined to avenge Balder, and a journey to the land of the dead is central to the story. This journey is especially intriguing because it suggests that the battle for Balder's fate happened not just in the world of the living, but in the realm beyond. However, each version gives a different reason and character for making that journey. In the poem, it is Odin who descends to seek knowledge. In Snorri's tale, Hermod rides down to bring Balder back. In Saxo's version, Hodor travels to the land of shadows to retrieve the magic sword he will use to kill Balder. There's another curious detail in Snorri's story. 3 days pass between the moment Balder is wounded and the time of his death. It's possible this was meant to reflect the cosmic struggle over his soul during that time, with various powers fighting for or against his survival. All the sources mention Balder's grand funeral. Snorri says he was placed on a ship and burned, likely based on an older poem. Saxo writes of a burial mound, and elsewhere he refers to the custom of burning warriors on ships after battle. These shared themes, even across such different accounts, help us understand the depth of the Balder legend. Snorri adds a final folkloric touch. He mentions an old belief that all things in the world weep for Balder, especially when the thaw begins after winter frost. Saxo, on the other hand, claims he knew specific traditions about Balder's duel with Hodor, and even the location of his grave. The weapon that kills Balder also differs between the two. Snorri describes it as a sprig of mistletoe, a seemingly harmless plant that becomes fatal. This detail gained fame thanks to comparisons with ancient sacred plants and golden branches used in other religious traditions. Saxo instead speaks of a sword, and in heroic legends, a famous sword called mistletoe is mentioned multiple times. It may be that the idea of a small object transforming into a deadly weapon, a theme seen in Odin's own stories, was simply adapted in different ways. Interestingly, mistletoe does not grow naturally in Iceland, making some believe it was not part of the original myth. When Saxo and Snorri set out to tell the story of Balder's death, they both faced a similar challenge. The sources they had were fragmented, cryptic, and deeply mysterious. These kinds of texts are the same ones that leave us scratching our heads when reading the Eddas, poems rich in magical symbols and otherworldly visions. Each author, in his own way, tried to make sense of these obscure traditions. Snorri, being a skilled storyteller, crafted a version that flowed beautifully and won the hearts of later generations. Saxo's account, though more chaotic and repetitive, preserved elements that may reflect older, forgotten strands of the myth. Despite its flaws, his version still holds value, offering glimpses of an earlier form of the legend that Snorri may have reimagined. The idea that Loki was responsible for Baldur's death might not just be about mischief and trickery. It could be rooted in an older belief in a dark force from the underworld, working against Odin and striking down his son. In Snorri's telling, the mysterious old woman Thok refuses to weep for Baldur, and she is believed to be Loki in disguise. In the poem Baldur's Dreams, the seeress whom Odin consults is suddenly accused by him of being no wise woman at all, but rather the mother of giants. In response, she hints that she won't be seen again until Loki escapes his chains. This eerie moment suggests that Loki may have been speaking through her, possibly even taking on a monstrous female form. In some traditions, Loki is associated with Angerboda, the mother of monsters, who gives birth to the three great threats of Ragnarok: the serpent, the wolf, and Hel. All of this fits the older image of Loki, not as a cunning trickster of Asgard, but as a dark and ancient being tied to chaos and destruction. Baldur is commonly called Odin's son, and that has led many to assume he must be a god. But not all traditions agree. As we've seen earlier, some parts of Snorri's story seem influenced by beliefs surrounding the gods of fertility, the Vanir. Saxo's version paints a different picture. He sees Baldur not as a god, but as a great warrior on Earth, perhaps a mortal favored by Odin, possibly the child of a human woman visited by the god. In that view, Baldur is one of Odin's many heroic sons, gifted and powerful, but still human. Many of the early poetic references to Baldur support this idea and do not clearly define him as a god. One scholar even argued that the tale of Baldur's death should be seen as a heroic story, one of Odin's warriors meeting a tragic end, rather than as a myth about a dying deity. There's even a similar story in Anglo-Saxon legend. In the poem Beowulf, a prince named Herebeald is accidentally killed by his own brother, Hæþcyn, in a hunting mishap. The tale is brief but powerful, especially the part where their father grieves his loss, unable to seek revenge for such a tragic accident. The names Herebeald and Hæþcyn bear a striking resemblance to Baldur and Hödur, and the comparison grows even stronger when you consider that the poem associates death by hanging with Woden, a god linked to sacrifice and death. Some have suggested that this is an early version of the Baldur story, remembered and reshaped in Anglo-Saxon England. Like Saxo's version, it features two royal brothers, one of whom unknowingly kills the other, possibly through the influence of some curse or dark magic. Among all the stories that have come down to us from the ancient North, Baldur's is perhaps the most haunting and enigmatic. We can't explore every layer of it here. It would take an entire book to do so. But it's important to recognize how Snorri's moving tale, beautiful as it is, might have led us astray. His vision of Baldur, gentle, radiant, doomed, may have been shaped by ideas from other myths, especially those of the Vanir, where dying and rebirth play a central role. But in older traditions, Baldur may not have been a god destined to fall. He might have been a beloved hero, cut down despite the favor of the gods, a mortal whose fate echoed through both this world and the next. In that light, he stands among the great heroes of the North, figures whose stories belong as much to myth as to memory. Long before the universe was formed, before time, space, or matter as we know it, there was no place for gods to dwell. This idea is echoed even by early Christian thinkers, such as Bishop Daniel of Winchester, who reminded his audience that before creation, there was no space in which divine beings could exist, not even the heavens or the earth. And yet, when Snorri Sturluson came to write his myths, he described the gods as living in a structured realm. Like the Olympians of ancient Greece, who resided atop Mount Olympus, the Norse gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, lived together in a grand celestial city known as Asgard. This was not an isolated domain, but part of a vast cosmic system. At the heart of this mythological universe stood Yggdrasil, the world tree. This great tree connected the different regions of existence, the realm of the gods, the world of the giants, and the land of the dead. While Snorri's descriptions paint a neat cosmological picture, the myths themselves are more fluid. There were no rigid borders keeping giants far from human lands or confining the dead to distant realms. Instead, these worlds overlapped, blending into each other with mystery and power. Still, the idea of these realms and their spiritual meanings ran deep in the minds of those who told the tales. The world tree, Yggdrasil, was more than just a backdrop for the myths. It was the symbolic center of everything. In Northern Europe, people once believed in the presence of sacred trees standing next to homes and temples, guardians of the places they watched over. Even in the British Isles, traces of this belief survived, such as at Knaresborough, where a great tree was built into the very foundation of a house. In ancient times, temples of the gods, like the great sanctuary at Uppsala, where Odin and Freyr were worshipped, were said to have stood beside a mighty tree, one that remained green in both summer and winter. Scholars have long debated what kind of tree Yggdrasil truly was. Some believed it was a sacred yew, others an ash, and in some traditions, even an oak. The oak, sacred especially to Thor, was often paired with a holy spring, just as Yggdrasil was said to have waters at its roots. There are also hints that the tree gave food and drink to the gods, an idea likely borrowed from older Eastern myths. Yggdrasil wasn't only a guardian tree, trembling at the approach of the world's end. It was also the tree of life, touching every corner of the cosmos. It stretched its limbs over all lands, linking gods, humans, giants, and the dead in a vast cosmic ladder, reaching from the heavens above to the underworld below. This vision of a tree connecting all realms is common in many shamanic traditions, especially among the peoples of northeastern Europe and Central Asia. Shamans in these cultures often describe climbing a sacred tree or ladder, passing through layers of the heavens during trances, in journeys that take their spirits into other worlds. In their rituals, this mystical ascent might be symbolized by a post with carved steps, a small birch tree, or even a spiritual bridge. Norse mythology shares many of these same themes, suggesting a deep link between northern beliefs and those found farther east. The idea that the gods' world consisted of layered realms appears in the poems of the Edda. In one poem, the seeress speaks of 9 worlds, held within the world tree. From his high seat, Hlidskjalf, Odin could gaze upon all of them, perhaps even from within the tree itself. But these worlds were not close together. The journey from one to another was long, treacherous, and often perilous. Travelers crossed mountains, icy wastes, and vast darkness to reach them. The Norse imagination grasped the immensity of the universe long before science revealed the scale of the stars. To them, the cosmos was vast, layered, and filled with wonder and terror. Bridges also played a powerful symbolic role. They linked worlds together, often fragile and dangerous to cross. Some were as thin as a blade, as narrow as a needle. Only those with immense spiritual strength could make the crossing. When Hermod rode to seek Balder, he traveled across the Gjallar Bridge, so named for its echoing sound under Sleipnir's hooves. Another great bridge was Bifrost, often described as a rainbow or a bridge of fire, connecting earth to the divine. The gods rode across it daily, and some believed it to be the Milky Way itself, a road of stars shining in the night sky. But even this mighty bridge would not last. At Ragnarok, the final battle, it would be shattered by the invading forces of chaos. In Norse mythology, there are stories of a great gate that marks the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Known by different names, Helgrind, Nagrind, or Valgrind, it was this gate that Sleipnir, Odin's mighty eight-legged steed, leapt over when carrying Hermod on his descent into the underworld to seek Balder. This gate was said to open when the dead returned to visit the land of the living, and in many myths, one must also cross rushing waters to reach the world beyond. Even as the myths describe vast distances, formidable barriers, and a sense of separation between the realms, the idea of the world tree, Yggdrasil, remains ever present as the eternal center of all existence. This powerful image reached far beyond the Norse world. Traces of this belief can be found in the ancient religions of Mesopotamia and Iran, and it has left a deep and lasting imprint on the religious imagination of Europe and Asia. The beings that inhabit Yggdrasil reflect a symbolic battle that transcends cultures. The eagle at the top and the serpent at the roots mirror an ancient duality. In southern Borneo, the cosmos is imagined as a tree, where the eagle embodies the masculine sky and the serpent represents the feminine earth. Their eternal struggle is believed to destroy the tree again and again, only for it to grow back anew. This archetypal conflict also appears in Greek mythology and can be seen echoed in Norse tradition. In the Eddic poem Grimnismal, the world tree is described as suffering constant torment. A stag gnaws at its branches, rot sets in at its side, and a great serpent, Nidhöggr, devours its roots. A squirrel named Ratatosk races up and down the tree, delivering messages between the eagle and the serpent, messages that are said to be filled with malice. This dynamic of bird and snake in perpetual struggle is not only found in legend, it mirrors the natural world. The symbolism is unmistakable. The eagle soars above as the lord of the heavens, while the serpent slithers below, tied to the earth. And like the squirrel, the shaman or mystic serves as the bridge between the two. For humans, in their dual nature, belong to both sky and soil. The name Yggdrasil has been much debated. The most widely accepted meaning is the horse of Ygg, with Ygg being one of the many names for Odin. According to this interpretation, the world tree is Odin's gallows, the place where he sacrificed himself in his quest for knowledge. In Old Norse and Old English traditions, the phrase riding the gallows was a poetic way to describe hanging. This association appears in several sagas, where dreams of great horses are taken as omens of death by hanging. But the tree goes by many other names as well. It is called the Sheltering One, the Treasure of Mimir, and the Pole of Mimir, each title reflecting its sacred role. At its base lies a holy spring, closely tied to the mysterious figure of Mimir, the guardian of wisdom, and to Urd, one of the Norns who governs fate. Snorri wrote of 3 springs beneath the tree's roots, but it's more likely that there was just one, a singular wellspring of life and knowledge, much like the one beneath the great temple at Uppsala. This spring nourishes the ash tree with a liquid known as ore, a word believed to mean pure, shining water. Dew falls from the tree's branches, and legend tells that when the heart feeds upon them, her milk becomes an everlasting mead. This sacred drink is said to refresh the warriors of Valhalla. The tree itself hides a man and a woman who survive the terrible winter that signals the end of the world. They live on the morning dew, sheltered within its trunk, and emerge to repopulate the earth. Some scholars suggest that one of the tree's more obscure names, often rendered as Mjötvidur, may actually mean mead tree, referencing its role as a source of life-giving sustenance. This image closely mirrors the milk-bearing tree of the Finno-Ugric peoples, which likely shares ancient roots with the myths of Mesopotamia. Yggdrasil is not only the center of the cosmos, it is the origin of new life. As the guardian of birth and rebirth, the tree stands over the spring where the Norns dwell. These mysterious figures, deeply associated with destiny and fate, are also linked to childbirth. In the poem Svipdagsmal, the tree's healing powers are invoked. Its fruits are burned and given to women in labor to help bring forth life. This fits into a broader shamanistic belief that the tree is where unborn souls reside, clinging to its branches like leaves. Among some Finno-Ugric peoples, it is said that when a leaf falls, a person dies, and so the destinies of all are literally written on the leaves of the cosmic tree. These ideas feature prominently in the initiation visions of shamans from across northern and central Asia. The similarities between the Norse conception of Yggdrasil and the beliefs of Finno-Ugric peoples are too detailed and vivid to be purely coincidental. While some aspects of the tree myth may stem from an older pre-Christian European heritage, others seem to have entered Norse tradition later, possibly through contact with Eastern cultures. During the Viking Age, Norse traders and settlers traveled along the great rivers of Russia to the Black Sea, opening up routes to Byzantium and Asia. Along the way, they would have encountered peoples steeped in shamanic traditions, whose vision of the cosmos centered on a sacred tree, just like their own. In time, the symbol of the world tree would fade from religious thought, replaced by the image of the Christian cross, believed to stand at the very center of the earth, on the hill of Calvary, where the fatal tree of Eden once stood. Yet when Snorri compiled his myths from the old Edda poems, he showed no awareness of this symbolic transition. Instead, he preserved the memory of a tree that touched every realm, one that stood tall in the imagination of a people who saw the world as vast, layered, and alive with divine purpose. And so, Yggdrasil remains, a living axis around which the myths of the North still turn, bridging the worlds of gods, men, and the dead. In Norse mythology, the universe was not eternal. It had a beginning, and it was destined for an end. This cosmic story was captured in powerful poetic form by an unknown author near the end of the pagan era. That poem, known as Völuspá, became the foundation for Snorri Sturluson's famous account of creation and destruction in his prose Edda. Though we cannot be sure whether the poet crafted a unified vision from scattered fragments or was expressing a belief system already widely accepted, it's clear from other surviving sources that Völuspá was not an isolated voice. Its themes and imagery resonate across different texts and traditions. The poem opens with a haunting vision of the world before time. There was no earth, no sky, no sea or sand, no grass or trees, only a vast emptiness called Ginnungagap. This yawning void held the potential for creation, a pregnant silence before the birth of all things. Some scholars believe the name Ginnungagap is linked to the power of illusion and magical deception. an otherworldly space where appearances shift and reality is fluid. This interpretation echoes the title of another part of Snorri's work, Gylfaginning, which means the deluding of Gylfi, and suggests a world where magic shapes existence. Even outside of Scandinavia, this idea of a primordial void was known. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, uses a term that seems to match Ginnungagap. In southern Germany, an old Christian poem known as the Wessobrunn Prayer opens with a vision very similar to that of Völuspá. It describes a time before sky and earth, before trees and mountains, before the sun or moon had begun to shine. While its creation story is shaped by Christian ideas, the resemblance suggests that an older, shared tradition lingered beneath the surface. This same theme appears in Beowulf, where a minstrel in Hrothgar's hall sings of how the Almighty shaped the world, lit it with sun and moon, and adorned it with green life. The beauty of that creation stands in stark contrast to the shadowy realm of monsters like Grendel, and the tension between these two worlds may reflect older, pre-Christian beliefs. The true origin of the Norse creation myth is complex. Snorri preserves at least 3 different versions. In one, the world begins in the meeting of fire and ice. As cold spreads from the north and sparks rise from the south, the heat melts the frost and gives shape to a primal being, Ymir. From this first giant, all other giants are descended. He is nourished by the milk of a divine cow named Audumla, who herself emerges from the ice. When Ymir is finally slain by the gods, his body is used to craft the world. His flesh becomes the land, his bones the mountains, his blood the seas, and his skull the heavens above. In another version, the first gods are said to have been born from blocks of salty ice, licked into shape by the cow. These gods then go on to fashion the world. A third version introduces a giant named Bergelmir, who escapes a flood caused by the blood of Ymir and survives to found a new race. This tale is less convincing and may reflect a later Christian influence, echoing the story of Noah. The name Bergelmir itself seems connected to rivers and watery depths, suggesting that it might be part of a different mythic layer. More importantly, it contradicts the idea that the world was formed from the sacrifice of Ymir, one of the most enduring elements in Norse cosmology. The stories of Ymir and Audumla have many parallels in mythologies around the world. The slaying of a primeval being to bring forth creation is a recurring theme. Ymir's name may even be linked to the Sanskrit word Yama, suggesting a hybrid or androgynous nature. Roman historian Tacitus described a similar figure in Germanic lore, Tuisto, whose son Manus was said to be the ancestor of humanity. Some have tried to associate Tuisto with ancient sky gods, but it seems more likely that he, like Ymir, was a being with a dual nature, one from whom both male and female life could emerge. In Fafnir, a poem from the Poetic Edda, we are told that from beneath Ymir's arm, a man and woman were born, and from his feet, a new giant was formed. These details strengthen the idea that Ymir was a twofold being. Similar myths exist in Indian tradition, where the first man and woman spring from a unified primal figure. Ymir's body not only births the world, but gives rise to both gods and giants, a concept that can hardly be dismissed as a later borrowing from Christianity or Judaism. In fact, poetic references to Ymir's skull forming the sky suggest this was a widespread and deeply rooted belief in the North. Fragments of this myth may even survive in tales of constellations. The eyes of the giant Thiazi were said to be cast into the sky by Odin, becoming stars. Another story tells of the frozen toe of Orvandil, which Thor flung into the heavens. These tales preserve a cosmic memory of body parts becoming celestial bodies, hinting at a time when the boundaries between flesh and starlight, life and cosmos, were fluid and magical. The figure of the cosmic cow in Norse mythology, Audhumla, finds distant echoes in other ancient cultures. In Egypt and throughout the Near East, the cow symbolized the fertile earth and was often associated with life-giving abundance. Yet Audhumla is distinctly Norse. Her name means a rich, hornless cow, and she appears from the melting ice at the dawn of time. Streams of milk flowed from her udders, forming rivers that nourished the emerging world. This image mirrors other mythological themes, like the world tree offering sustenance to gods and mortals, but with some uncertainty. In different stories, it's not always clear whether the life-giving source is a cow, a goat, or a stag. Like Ymir, Audhumla emerged from the icy void and played a crucial role in bringing life into the world. She licked the salty blocks of ice, slowly revealing the first gods within. Some scholars suggest this myth may have connections to real sacred locations in ancient Germany, such as the salt springs near the river Seil, where people believed their prayers could reach the heavens. These springs, heated by fire and soaked by river water, combined the elements of salt, fire, and water, just as in the myth of creation. A great battle was once fought over this sacred place, underscoring its deep spiritual importance. Yet another explanation for the imagery of fire and ice meeting in Norse creation myths may come from Iceland itself. The island's dramatic volcanic landscape, where molten lava erupts beneath glaciers and melts the ice in violent floods, offers a vivid real-world model of how life could be imagined to emerge from chaos. These explosive events, lava surging through snow and steam boiling from deep cracks, must have left a deep impression on Viking Age minds and may have shaped the mythology of creation. Interestingly, Scandinavian mythology seems to lack a motif common in other traditions: the idea of the world being born from a cosmic egg. This symbol appears in ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Mithraic beliefs, and survives in Finnish folklore. In one Finnish tale, the world begins when a duck lays an egg on the knee of the hero Väinämöinen, floating in a vast, watery void. But the Norse myths follow a different path. The poetic traditions that inspired Völuspá and other Eddic works appear to have developed independently of this egg-born creation theme. In the Norse version of creation, the giant Ymir is killed by three brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve, who then use his body to shape the world. A similar trio appears in Manichaean myths, where three gods slay a demon to form the cosmos. But the Norse tradition seems homegrown. There are several mentions of Odin's brothers in other sources. In one tale, Frigg is accused of taking both Vili and Ve as lovers. Another account tells how Odin once disappeared for a long time, leaving his brothers to rule in his place, and even take his wife. These stories suggest that the three gods were well known in northern tradition, and their names, especially Vili, were preserved by skaldic poets. Some have suggested that these names represent abstract qualities like will and holiness, but they seem far too personal and long established to be mere symbolic figures. This trio reappears in the myth of human creation. According to Völuspá, Odin, along with Honir and Lodur, found two lifeless trees on the seashore, Ask and Embla, and gave them life. Odin breathed into them spirit, Honir gave them understanding, and Lodur gave them physical form and senses. The name Ask connects clearly with the world ash, the central tree of the cosmos, and possibly with Anglo-Saxon traditions where Ask is remembered as the founding ancestor of a tribe. Embla's name may link to the elm tree, though the exact reason for choosing that tree is unclear. Another myth tells of two humans, Lif and Lifthrasir, who survived a great cataclysm by hiding within the world tree. As the rest of the world fell into ruin, they were nourished by the dew on its branches. Snorri interpreted this to mean they endured the end times and later repopulated the earth. If Norse mythology teaches us that the cosmos follows a cycle of destruction and renewal, then this moment marks the beginning of a new creation. And fittingly, it is the world tree itself, from which the universe first grew, that offers shelter and sustenance for life to rise again after the world ends. Some of the most striking and powerful lines in Völuspá are those that describe the end of the world, the fated doom of the gods. Snorri Sturluson later retold these verses in his Prose Edda, transforming them into noble and vivid prose in his account of Ragnarok. According to the prophecy, the end begins with a terrible winter, called the Fimbulvetur, that lasts for 3 unbroken years. During this time, the world is thrown into chaos. Mankind turns on itself in violence and despair, and the earth trembles with massive earthquakes. The sun goes dark. Monsters once bound are finally unleashed. A great serpent rises from the sea, stirring the waters into a vast flood that swallows the land. From the realm of the dead, a ship made from the uncut nails of corpses sails forth, carrying an army of giants. Another force, led by Surtur the fire giant, marches across the Rainbow Bridge toward Asgard. The gods gather their forces, and on a great battlefield, they clash in a final apocalyptic war. In this battle, the gods and monsters destroy each other. Only a few of the gods' sons survive. And when the fires die down, Surtur unleashes one last blaze that consumes the sky and the earth. But just when all seems lost, Völuspá offers a vision of renewal, of a new world rising green and beautiful from the sea, where the surviving gods recall the past as one might wake from a dark and distant dream. Most of this story comes directly from Völuspá, with only minor additions made by Snorri. While the language of the poem can be difficult, and many of its references mysterious, such as the unclear identity of Gulveig, who was burned 3 times by the Aesir, its emotional force remains intact, even for modern readers. Some have suggested that the poem's ending hints at the rise of Christianity, portraying it as the faith that triumphs over the old gods. But if that were truly the poet's intention, one might expect it to be more obvious. Interpreting it this way risks missing its deeper meaning. The poem doesn't read as a rejection of Norse belief, but rather as a timeless reflection on death and rebirth, an idea that lies at the heart of many great religions. Such an even-handed portrayal of the old faith seems unlikely from a Christian poet in an age when new beliefs often came with condemnation. Snorri himself may have had a dual perspective, but he made his Christian allegiance clear from the beginning. In contrast, a pagan poet may have sensed that his gods were fading, and Völuspá carries the sorrowful tone of someone witnessing the end of a sacred era. What's clear is that this poem didn't come out of nowhere. It's not a random patchwork of disconnected ideas. There's enough evidence to show that the concepts in Völuspá were already circulating during the pagan period. The Danish scholar Axel Ulrich explored this in his famous study of Ragnarok, looking at old folk beliefs across Denmark and beyond. He found many fascinating echoes of the poem. Stories of a ship built from dead men's nails, tales of monsters devouring the sun, and legends of the earth sinking beneath the sea. There were even stories of a giant, long bound in chains, who would one day break free and destroy the world. Similar themes appear in other mythologies. In ancient Iranian belief, a catastrophic winter is foretold, and some humans and animals are protected from it inside a shelter built by Yima. There was also a custom of offering fingernails to a sacred bird to prevent them from falling into evil hands, a possible parallel to the Norse myth about the Ship of Nails. Celtic mythology also includes a tale of gods and giants fighting on a massive plain, with most of the gods falling in battle. While there's no direct link between Norse and Celtic traditions, the core ideas are strikingly similar. Even the Greek geographer Strabo reported that the Druids believed the soul and the world were immortal, but that one day fire and water would sweep them away. These shared patterns have led some to claim Christian influence on Völuspá, pointing to similarities with biblical imagery, such as stars falling, the sun going dark, and a burning world at Judgment Day. But it's important to remember that when anyone imagines the end of the world, certain visions naturally arise. Fire, floods, darkness, and cosmic collapse are powerful and universal symbols. In Iceland, a land of fire and ice, the idea of destruction through heat and cold would have felt especially real. Volcanoes and glacial floods were part of life. It's no surprise that such elemental forces shaped the myths of the people. Even if the poem's creator had never read a Christian text, images like darkened skies and melting mountains could still spring from his imagination. Writers across cultures and centuries have used such cosmic metaphors. Robert Burns, for example, wrote that he would love his beloved until the seas dried up and the rocks melted in the sun. These are not uniquely Christian ideas. They are part of the shared poetic imagination of humankind. So while the fire and brimstone sermons of medieval preachers may have influenced some, they don't fully explain Völuspá. The myth of the world's end already existed in the hearts and minds of the pagan North, long before the new religion arrived. In Norse mythology, the idea of the world's eventual destruction, known as Ragnarok, can be traced back through ancient poems and sagas. In some of the earliest skaldic poetry, we find references hinting at cataclysmic events, like the stars falling from the sky or the earth being consumed by vast floods. For instance, Saxo Grammaticus vividly describes a battle in which the heavens collapse, forests and fields disappear, and chaos engulfs everything. This poetic description suggests that such apocalyptic imagery was deeply embedded in Norse culture. One fascinating piece of evidence for this belief is found on a rune-carved stone from Skarpalur in Sweden. Scholars have translated its message as foretelling the tearing apart of both earth and heaven. If this interpretation is accurate, it indicates that the idea of the world's end was not just poetic imagination, but a concept taken seriously enough to be inscribed on a memorial stone. Notably, this stone does not follow traditional Christian symbolism, featuring instead a unique image of a cross emerging from a ship, perhaps signifying the vessel of the dead. This strengthens the likelihood that the rune inscription is actually quoting an older Norse poem. Another essential element of Ragnarok depicted in Norse poems is the unleashing of monstrous creatures. In the poem Eiríksmal, Odin explains that a fallen king was chosen to join his warriors because the giant wolf was already preparing to attack the realm of gods. Such indirect references imply the Norse audience was already familiar with Ragnarok, and understood its symbolism. Moreover, each god's adversary in the Ragnarok myth had a clear mythological reason for confrontation. Thor would battle the world serpent, Tyr would face revenge from the beast he once bound, and Freyr would fight the fiery giant Surt without his powerful sword, lost when he married Gerd. Some researchers argue that Ragnarok may reflect Christian influences, pointing to parallels like Heimdall's horn and Gabriel's trumpet. Yet, these similarities might just as easily represent broad cultural influences rather than direct borrowings from Christian teachings about the Last Judgment. Scholars who argue Ragnarok was simply an adaptation of Christian ideas often overlook the deeply rooted nature of this myth within Norse tradition itself. Interestingly, elements of Ragnarok share similarities with legends from outside Scandinavia, particularly from Germanic and even Iranian cultures. Certain Old Saxon poems mention a destructive force called muspili, closely linked to fire and chaos. Some experts suggest this concept was originally a pagan belief that persisted even after Christianity took hold. Others propose connections to Iranian myths of world-ending firestorms. Though intriguing, these comparisons are speculative, and clear evidence for direct borrowing from these distant cultures remains elusive. Physical representations of Ragnarok exist beyond literary texts. Viking-era carvings in northern England vividly illustrate scenes from the apocalypse described in Norse myths. At Gosforth in Cumbria, detailed carvings depict bound monsters, warriors battling ferocious beasts, and figures clearly identifiable from the Ragnarok narrative, such as Loki and his wife Sigyn. Though set within a Christian context, as indicated by a depiction of the crucifixion on the same cross, these carvings clearly rely on traditional Norse imagery, suggesting the coexistence and blending of pagan and Christian beliefs. Other sculptures in the region reinforce this interpretation, including tombstones decorated with combat scenes and mythological beasts. Such widespread artistic evidence supports the view that Ragnarok was not merely a literary theme, but a significant and widely recognized symbolic representation of death and chaos in the Viking Age. Memorializing these scenes on gravestones and monuments reveals the profound resonance these myths had with ordinary people, reflecting their understanding of life's fragility and the inevitability of destruction and renewal. In Norse mythology, the destructive giant known as Surt plays a central role in Ragnarok, although interestingly, he does not appear in the stone carvings depicting the apocalypse. Some scholars have speculated that Surt might represent a volcanic deity, inspired by the powerful eruptions common in Iceland. Ancient Icelanders named volcanic places after Surt, including the dark caves in the island's volcanic heartland. This suggests that he was imagined as a giant dwelling deep. The Icelandic scholar Bertha Philpotts famously proposed that the mythological portrayal of Surt setting fire to heaven and earth might have its roots in actual volcanic eruptions witnessed by the Norse people. Iceland, known for frequent volcanic activity, provided vivid real-world examples resembling the cataclysms described in the poems. Historical eruptions, such as the massive Skaptur Jökull event in 1783, match closely with the dramatic sequence found in Ragnarok myths. Earthquakes, darkened skies, smoke, ash, flames, melting glaciers, devastating floods, and even tidal waves. This striking parallel suggests that the Norse poets who created these stories may have drawn directly from experiences of volcanic disasters in Iceland. Life, according to Norse beliefs, began with the clash of heat and cold, fire and ice. It would be natural for them to imagine that the world's end would mirror its beginning. once again uniting the extremes of fire and water in a spectacular, destructive display. Beyond volcanic imagery, the Ragnarok narrative also emphasizes other catastrophes that northern peoples constantly feared: harsh, deadly winters and catastrophic flooding. These disasters were not unique to Norse culture, but the conditions of their northern homelands, with its long, bitter winters and stormy seas, made such images especially powerful and vivid. Poetic genius likely merged these ideas of environmental destruction with mythical tales of monsters breaking loose to challenge and ultimately destroy the gods. Unlike the stone carvings, which focus primarily on the dramatic battles between gods and monsters, the literary versions of Ragnarok highlight a broader, natural catastrophe. The poet of the Völuspá masterfully combined these separate concepts into a cohesive and compelling narrative, creating an unforgettable vision of cosmic destruction. This vivid portrayal, later retold by Snorri Sturluson, feels authentic and deeply rooted, rather than simply borrowed from foreign or scattered traditions. Clearly, Norse beliefs about the end of the world were powerful enough to survive for centuries, even as Christianity spread across northern Europe. The potent images of the earth sinking beneath the waves, the triumph of ice and fire, and the unleashing of monstrous forces resonated deeply in the collective imagination. These themes perhaps symbolized deeper human anxieties about chaos, mental collapse, and the inevitability of death itself, giving Ragnarok enduring emotional and symbolic power. Ultimately, the myth of Ragnarok stands as a compelling reflection of human fears and hopes. It portrays not just destruction, but also the possibility of rebirth and renewal. This profound vision, captured vividly in Norse poetry, continues to fascinate and inspire audiences today, highlighting universal themes that speak to the very core of human experience.